Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Patrick de la Cerda. Patrick de la Cerda was born in June 1992 in Miami, Florida, to a loving family. His father, Max de la Cerda, was from Spain, and his mother, Patricia Ronza, was from France, and moved to the US in the 1980s, where she married Max and had Patrick. Patrick grew up in a supportive and caring environment, surrounded by his parents' kindness, mutual respect, and care. He was a bright, sociable, and friendly person who excelled in school and made friends easily. His parents prioritized his education and upbringing, providing him with every opportunity to become a worthy individual. Patrick's father was a skilled construction specialist who had worked in the field all his life. Although the family wasn't wealthy, they were considered well off by city standards. After high school, Patrick decided to follow in his father's footsteps by enrolling in the construction faculty. However, during his university years, his parents divorced after nearly 25 years of marriage. The divorce was amicable, with no conflicts or disputes over property. Patrick's mother moved to Deltona, where she remarried, while Patrick chose to stay with his father in Miami, where they worked together as respected professionals in the construction industry. Despite their divorce, the family remained extremely close-knit and supportive. They regularly kept in touch through phone calls and were always willing to help each other when needed. Patrick frequently visited his mother in Deltona, sharing his life updates, happiness, and experiences, and introducing her to his love interests. With his mixed French-Spanish heritage, Patrick had a charming appearance from a young age, making him popular among they. However, having grown up in a family that valued strong relationships, he never pursued casual flings, instead seeking true mutual love and a strong, loving family of his own. Patrick met Jessica on a popular dating site in June 2017. Although he wasn't sure he'd find someone special, he was drawn to her striking appearance and charming smile. Jessica, born in 1988 in Orlando, Florida, responded to his message, and they started communicating easily. She had studied banking at a local university and worked at a bank branch in Orlando. As they shared their thoughts and experiences, they quickly developed mutual sympathy and trust. After exchanging phone numbers, they talked for hours every evening for the next couple of weeks, building a strong connection. The young people, Patrick and Jessica, decided to meet in person after connecting online. Because they lived in different parts of the state, they chose a midpoint for their meeting. On their first date, Patrick was immediately smitten with Jessica and knew he wanted to be with her. Jessica also felt a strong connection, although she was slightly taken aback by their 4-year age difference. Thrilled, Patrick called his mom, Patricia, on the way home to tell her about the girl he wanted to marry and start a family with. Patricia could hear the excitement in her son's voice and knew he was serious, making her happy for him. As their long-distance relationship continued for several months, the couple faced the challenge of living far apart, only able to see each other on weekends in neutral locations. To spend quality time together, they would often rent a cozy hotel room in a secluded spot. They cherished these moments, but by Sunday evening, they would reluctantly part ways, returning to their respective homes to prepare for work on Monday morning. In December 2017, Patrick moved to Delton to be closer to his girlfriend Jessica, who lived nearby. He purchased a house in a quiet neighborhood and started renovating it to create a cozy home for when Jessica would join him. However, Jessica was unable to leave her job immediately, so they planned to have a housewarming party in early spring the following year. As the new year approached, Patrick decided to propose to Jessica. He set up a romantic surprise, arranging fireworks in the backyard of his new house. While Jessica was distracted by the display, Patrick got down on one knee and presented her with a ring, asking her to be his wife. Overjoyed, Jessica accepted his proposal. Patrick revealed that he had been searching for the perfect engagement ring for a long time, but couldn't find one that met his high standards. He settled for a decent ring from a jewelry store to propose before the new year, but he had already commissioned a custom-made ring from a jewelry workshop, designed specifically to his taste. Patrick's life was about to take a dramatic turn. It had been 2 months since he got engaged, and wedding and housewarming preparations were in full swing. Both sets of parents had given their blessing, and the happy couple was ecstatic about their future together. They were planning a grand celebration in either Miami or France, the groom's mother's hometown. But on February 27, 2018, concern set in when Max, Patrick's father, received a call from a courier. The delivery company had listed Max's number as an alternate contact. The courier reported that Patrick's order had been delivered to his address, but he wasn't answering the door or his phone. This wasn't like Patrick, and Max immediately felt worried. Since he was at work and couldn't check on his son, he decided to ask his future daughter-in-law for help. Patrick's father called Jessica, his voice laced with anxiety, saying he couldn't reach his son. Jessica had been trying to contact Patrick all morning, but he hadn't replied to her messages or calls. When she told Patrick's father, Max, he feared something must have happened to him. Jessica rushed to Patrick's house as quickly as possible. When she arrived, she saw his car in the driveway, suggesting he hadn't left. Using her own key, she entered the yard and loudly called out to Patrick, but there was no response. Jessica cautiously opened the front door and was met with a horrific scene. Her fiancé lay at the entrance, surrounded by a pool of his own blood, showing no signs of life. She immediately called emergency services, but the paramedics who arrived were unable to help Patrick and sadly declared him dead. By the time the police arrived, Jessica was devastated, sobbing in the backyard of the house where Patrick had proposed to her just 2 months prior. When an officer approached her, she pointed an accusatory finger at a single individual, a wealthy and influential ex-boyfriend. According to Jessica, he was responsible for murdering her lover and destroying her life. To make sense of this complex case, it's essential to go back in time to when Jessica and Patrick first met. At that point, Jessica was in a relationship with Gregory Bender, a successful businessman who owned an investment fund. He was 20 years older than her and had swept her off her feet during her student years. Gregory lavished her with expensive gifts and exotic getaways, and Jessica believed she had found her soulmate. However, she soon began to notice peculiarities in his behavior that raised red flags. Gregory exerted control over his girlfriend Jessica, monitoring her every move and conversation. If she had a male admirer, he would threaten and intimidate them away. Meanwhile, he was secretive about his own life, sharing little information with her. Their 8-year relationship was marked by Gregory's refusal to introduce Jessica to his family and friends. He dictated when they would spend time together, go on vacation, or visit his home, claiming to be too busy. Jessica longed for a normal family life, including having children, but Gregory always put it off, saying the time was not right. When Jessica attempted to end the relationship, Gregory proposed to her, and she accepted. However, nothing changed. They still lived apart and only saw each other when Gregory permitted. After Gregory was in a car accident and hospitalized, Jessica rushed to his side, but first, she stopped by his house to gather some belongings for him. Jessica encountered a mysterious woman at the house who refused to introduce herself and instead asked Jessica who she was. Jessica explained that she was the bride of the house's owner, showing her engagement ring as proof. The stranger then revealed her own ring and introduced herself as Diora Sanchez, Bender's legal wife. Stunned, Jessica decided to end her relationship with the cheating businessman. However, Gregory begged her to stay, promising to divorce Diora soon and marry Jessica instead. Naively, Jessica believed him, but time passed and nothing changed. Frustrated, she joined a dating site and met Patrick, with whom she started communicating. Finally, Jessica mustered the courage to break up with Gregory, but he refused to let her go. Bender initially tried to win Jessica back by promising to divorce his wife, but when that failed, he resorted to threats and harassment. When that didn't work, he became suspicious and decided to find out who Jessica was communicating with. He hired professionals to hack into her account and gather information. After discovering that Jessica was talking to Patrick, Gregory sent him threatening messages, claiming Jessica was his fiancée and demanding that he break up with her. While Patrick remained calm, believing the threats were empty, Jessica was terrified. She knew Bender had the means to carry out his threats, given his wealth, connections, and large collection of firearms. Jessica suggested ending their relationship to avoid hurting anyone, but Patrick refused to consider it. Instead, they went to the police and presented evidence of Gregory Bender's stalking and threats. As a result, they obtained a restraining order prohibiting Gregory from approaching or contacting them in any way. Additionally, the court ordered him to surrender all firearms in his possession. For a period of time, things seemed to return to normal, and the couple, Jessica and Patrick, thought they had finally escaped the stalker's attention. However, Jessica remained uneasy and persuaded Patrick to install security cameras both outside and inside their home, fearing that Gregory might ignore the restraining order. Let's go back to the tragic events of February 27, 2018. During the initial crime scene investigation, detectives quickly dismissed the possibility of a robbery and instead suspected a personal motive, given the brutality of the murder. The killer seemingly had a deep hatred for the victim. The 25-year-old victim's body had 4 gunshot wounds, including shots to the thigh, chest, and head. The examination also revealed injuries consistent with a fall from a ladder. The body was found lying on the floor between the front door and the stairs leading to the second floor. The killer likely sneaked into the house and waited for Patrick on the second floor. When Patrick climbed the stairs, the intruder ambushed him, shooting him in the thigh. Patrick fell down the stairs, and the killer followed, shooting him again in the chest and then delivering 2 fatal headshots. The murder weapon, a rare and hard-to-get pistol, was never found. However, investigators discovered 3 shell casings, 1 on the second floor and 2 more downstairs. The 4th shell casing was missing, suggesting the killer took it as a souvenir. Jessica claimed to know the killer's identity, but the police initially suspected Patrick's neighbor, a U.S. Army veteran who had a history of conflict with the victim. The neighbor had been wounded and concussed in combat, which led to a mental disorder. The veteran was skilled with firearms and had access to rare guns. In December 2017, he mistakenly shot at his new neighbor, thinking he was a burglar. Fortunately, no one was physically harmed, but the neighbor was hospitalized for a psychiatric condition that worsened due to the incident. After his return, the neighbor stalked Patrick, accusing him of being a spy and threatening to expose him. Given the neighbor's mental illness and potential motive, he was detained and questioned. Although he openly disliked Patrick, he had a solid alibi confirmed by multiple people at the time of the murder. The investigation focused on finding evidence and provoking a reaction from the perpetrator. The initial theory of a robbery was quickly dismissed since nothing was stolen or disturbed in the house, except for the hard drives containing video surveillance footage. This made it impossible to identify who entered or left the house that day. Forensic experts found no evidence, including fingerprints, shoe prints, or DNA traces, at the crime scene. The murder was meticulously planned, and although the investigators were convinced of Gregory's guilt, he seemed likely to get away with it. To catch him, the police devised a covert plan, asking Jessica to lure her former lover into a frank conversation. Jessica agreed and called Gregory, yelling at him, crying, and demanding to know why he had committed the crime. However, Gregory was suspicious from the start and feigned innocence, pretending to be shocked when Jessica accused him of murdering her fiancé. He even expressed condolences to her, never cracking under pressure. The police were unable to provoke him into a confession or a false move, and without sufficient evidence, they could only ask him to testify, but not detain or question him. Gregory had honored the restraining order and seemed to have moved on from his past with Jessica. Gregory Bender contacted the police with crucial information about the Patrick Della Cerda case. She had seen a suspicious notebook in her husband's office with a detailed plan of an unknown person's house and a strange algorithm of actions. Although she didn't think much of it at the time, she connected it to the crime after seeing a news report. The police searched her husband's office and found the notebook, but the relevant pages were missing. However, they were discovered in the trash can, where Gregory had carelessly discarded them. The pages contained a detailed plan of the crime, including instructions to avoid leaving traces. The records showed that Gregory had been stalking Patrick, knew his daily routine, and was aware of the surveillance cameras. Gregory tried to cover his tracks by disposing of evidence, but he made critical mistakes, including failing to destroy his records and underestimating his wife's curiosity. A fourth missing shell casing was found in a cigar box, confirmed to be from the crime scene. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, the prosecution had enough circumstantial evidence to warrant Gregory's arrest. At the trial, Jessica testified about her tumultuous relationship with Gregory, including harassment and threats. However, the defense strategy focused on deflecting blame onto Jessica, accusing her of provoking Gregory's actions and being motivated by material gain. The defense downplayed the evidence of a murder plan, suggesting it was just a fantasy, and argued that the search of Gregory's home was illegal and the shell casing could have been planted. They also questioned the identification of the gun model by Jessica. During a court session, the defendant Gregory Bender's ex-wife, Dora Sanchez, testified as a witness. Until then, Gregory had shown little emotion, but he suddenly became animated and unexpectedly declared his love for Dora. This surprising confession seemed to influence Dora's testimony, and she began to question her initial statements. Despite her earlier claims, Dora said she was forgetful and eventually claimed that, having lived with Gregory for many years, she couldn't believe he was capable of murder. However, despite the lack of direct evidence and the defense team's efforts to challenge the search of Gregory's home, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder after hours of deliberation. The judge sentenced Gregory to life imprisonment without parole. As the sentence was read, Gregory fixed an intense stare on Jessica, his eyes unblinking, and seemed to glare at her. This made Jessica feel ill and brought her close to a panic attack. Jessica Devani sat beside her late fiancé's mother, overwhelmed with emotion, sobbing, and choking back tears. Despite numerous appeals by Gregory and his legal team, all attempts to overturn the verdict were rejected. The public was fascinated by the case due to its shocking nature. A wealthy businessman brutally murdered a working-class man and tried to escape justice. Patrick Della Cerda's story has been widely reported, with Gregory currently in prison. Jessica finds comfort in keeping Patrick's memory alive and feels safe. She wears the ring he gave her and a special piece of jewelry he had intended to give her. She remains close to Patrick's parents, who have welcomed her into their family as if she were their own daughter. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today, we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Michaela Gerecht. On November 19, 1988, Michaela, then 9 years old, and her friend Katrina were busy trying on different outfits for an upcoming school performance at their homes. The joy was palpable as it marked the beginning of the Thanksgiving break. Around 10 a.m., Katrina's dad gave her $5 to buy some candy. The two friends rushed to Michaela's house to ask her mom if they could visit the nearby store, which was less than a mile away. Although they had been to the store many times before, with family or older neighbors, Michaela's mom was hesitant to let them go alone, citing their young age and lack of experience. After some cajoling, Michaela's mom finally agreed, on the condition that they would purchase the candy and head straight back home. As Michaela was her parents' long-awaited first child, a true miracle, her mom was particularly concerned about her safety. Despite her reservations, Michaela's mom believed that nothing bad would happen, given the store's proximity and their plan to ride their scooters there. Michaela raced back to Katrina's house. They planned to use 2 scooters, so Katrina took hers and borrowed another one from her brother. They went to the store, parked their scooters nearby, and went inside to make their purchases. When they came out, they got engrossed in conversation and completely forgot about their scooters. They started walking home but quickly realized their mistake and returned to where they had left the scooters. That's when they noticed Michaela's scooter was missing. Assuming someone had moved it, they decided to search the store area from different angles. Michaela scanned the parking lot and soon spotted her scooter next to a car parked a short distance from the store. As she approached it, Katrina suddenly heard a terrifying scream. She ran back and saw a man grabbing Michaela and forcing her into the car beside her scooter. The man promptly got back in the driver's seat and sped off. Shaken, Katrina rushed into the store and alerted the cashier about the incident. The cashier immediately called the police, who arrived at the scene within minutes. The store employee also contacted Michaela's father, as they were acquainted, and informed him of the situation. Michaela's father, accompanied by Katrina's father, hurried to the store where investigators had already gathered. He instructed his wife to remain at home by the phone, awaiting a possible call from the police. The detectives faced a multitude of challenges from the outset. The lack of surveillance cameras near the store and the sole witness, Katrina, who was in a state of deep shock and barely able to speak, hindered their progress. Her father was permitted to take her home, leaving the store cashier as the initial lead. She recounted a suspicious individual loitering around the store shortly before the abduction. He had parked his car, exited, but never entered the store, instead opting to walk along the building, peering through windows and seemingly watching them. The cashier had a gut feeling that he might be planning to rob her. Based on her description, the man was white, approximately 30 years old, and sported a prominent mustache. He arrived in an old maroon-colored sedan, but the model and license plate number remained unclear. After gathering the suspect's description, the police created a composite sketch and disseminated it to the media. News of the abduction spread rapidly throughout the city and beyond, leaving the public shocked that such a brazen act could occur in a busy area. The police also shared the sketch and a description of the suspect's car with hundreds of patrols and hidden in attics but not killed, seemed eerily prescient. At the time, her mother had found it strange for a 9-year-old to conceive such ideas, but in hindsight, it took on an uncanny, almost prophetic quality, leaving her to wonder if Michaela had unwittingly foreseen her own fate. In the 2 days following the abduction, the police launched an exhaustive search for the suspect and the missing girl, but despite their best efforts, they failed to make any progress. In a bid to gather more information, they decided to re-interview Katrina, hoping that time might have jogged her memory. However, this decision led to a perplexing twist. The girl who witnessed the abduction and the cashier provided contradictory descriptions of the kidnapper's appearance. Katrina described the man as around 20 years old, with long, unkempt, light-colored hair that reached his shoulders and a face covered in pimples. She also remembered his piercing blue eyes, reminiscent of a fox's. Furthermore, she recalled some details about the car, a beige sedan with a boxy shape and numerous dents. In contrast, the cashier's suspicion had been sparked by a man near the store whose description was vastly different from Katrina's. This discrepancy presented a significant challenge for the investigators, who had already circulated an inaccurate composite sketch of the suspect through the media, and to patrol officers, leading the search for an entirely different individual. This unfolding drama took place within the critical first 48 hours following the abduction, the most crucial period for a swift resolution. Based on her description, they promptly created a new composite sketch and redistributed it. Additionally, the police decided to interview all men in the area with prior convictions for sexual offenses. Numerous volunteers also joined the efforts, going door to door to interview residents in the hopes of someone recognizing the abductor or providing any other relevant information. They posted thousands of flyers featuring her photo and a description of the incident. And in just the initial few days, a staggering 42,000 of these flyers were distributed. After several days, they received their first promising lead. 3 individuals contacted them, reporting a hiking trip in a vast national park near their city. During their excursion, the hikers stumbled upon footprints on the ground, distinguishing one set belonging to an adult and another to a child. They decided to follow these tracks, eventually coming across a blanket and empty fast food wrappers deep in the forest. The police considered the possibility that these tracks might be connected to Maya and her abductor. The FBI's psychological profile also suggested that the abductor would likely take his victim to a secluded location, far removed from civilization. Given the park's size and its proximity to the city, it seemed to align perfectly with this theory. Detectives decided to conduct a thorough search of the park, utilizing all available resources. They scoured the ground, while helicopters equipped with thermal imaging scanned the area from above. However, all their efforts yielded nothing, as they couldn't find her or any incriminating evidence. The police extended their search to other parks, mountains, and remote areas, but all leads proved futile. Meanwhile, the case's nationwide media coverage sparked a deluge of tips, with over 4,000 received within the first month alone. Investigators faced the daunting task of pursuing each lead, a challenge that proved overwhelming. The case was a hot topic of discussion among San Francisco's neighboring residents and nearby cities, with prominent figures even making public appeals for information. As the search continued, a substantial $70,000 reward was offered, and Michaela's photograph was plastered on millions of milk cartons across the state. Despite the massive community effort and numerous leads, detectives made little headway. By December's end, a month and a half into the investigation, the police had only managed to exhaust thousands of leads, with no progress made in the following months. Still, the police, along with Michaela's mother, who had launched her own investigation, studying similar cases and searching for possible suspects, persisted in their efforts, holding on to the hope that Michaela was still alive, being held captive by her abductor. In 1991, detectives focused on 43-year-old Timothy Binder, and the deeper they dug into his background, the more disturbing it became. Before Michaela's abduction, Binder was already under police suspicion due to his odd behavior. He had been sending gifts, letters, and money to several young girls, with some of these letters featuring highlighted Bible passages that included phrases like, "I have chosen you," and "be with me." Parents of some of these girls grew concerned and reported him to the police, which led to an interrogation of Binder. He claimed he was simply trying to befriend these girls, thinking they were lonely. However, the investigation uncovered a worrying history. In 1985, Binder was fired from his job in Child Protective Services in Colorado for collecting personal information about young girls and then sending them gifts and letters. A search of his van revealed many photographs of children and Bible passages decorating the interior. Additionally, Binder had previously been arrested for trying to lure 2 girls into his van, although no charges were filed. Furthermore, he regularly visited local cemeteries, spending an unusual amount of time at the graves of young girls. 6 months before Michaela was abducted, a 7-year-old girl named Amber vanished in the same area. Binder got in touch with Amber's mother, offering to help and frequently visiting her home. He even sent a letter to the police, predicting that the next girl to go missing would be 9 years old. Months later, Michaela, who was also 9, was abducted. After she disappeared, Binder contacted her mother repeatedly, visited her home, and offered his assistance. But the disturbing pattern continued. In early December 1988, Binder sent a Christmas card to an FBI profiler he had spoken to before, and the card showed a girl holding up 4 fingers. Shortly after, a 4-year-old girl went missing in the same town. Despite these disturbing circumstances, which comprised circumstantial evidence, detectives secured a search warrant for Bender's home, where he resided with his wife. Unfortunately, their search yielded no concrete leads linking him to the abductions. When news of Bender's peculiar behavior hit the newspapers, the public began to suspect he might be a serial killer, resulting in harassment and attacks on him and his family. He subsequently sued the city authorities for disseminating misinformation and emerged victorious. Detectives persisted in investigating Bender for several months, but ultimately concluded that there was no concrete evidence implicating him in these crimes. Some detectives believed that he posed no threat to children, and his unusual behavior might have been unrelated to these cases. Consequently, the police shifted their focus towards alternative suspects. A new substantial lead did not emerge until December 1992, 4 years after Michaela's disappearance. An inmate from Indiana, serving time for robbery, contacted the police, claiming to know the identity of her abductor. He stated that he had helped bury her body in the same park where traces of evidence had been discovered. Initially, investigators showed little interest in this tip, but when the inmate wrote a letter to a prominent San Francisco newspaper, the police faced harsh criticism, and under public pressure, they reluctantly decided to interview him. He promised not only to pinpoint Michaela's exact burial site, but also to lead them directly to the killer. The inmate was transferred to California, where he collaborated with the police on a search mission. He claimed that the body was buried in a gladiolus field, and the officers devoted all their resources to scouring that area. The search lasted 8 hours, until the inmate unexpectedly confessed that he had fabricated the entire story. He explained that his intention was to bring some comfort to Michaela's family and help them find closure. However, Michaela's relatives and the police were outraged by his false statement. As a consequence, the inmate received an additional 6.5-year prison sentence, nearly doubling his original sentence, and was ordered to pay Michaela's family $6,000 in compensation. In August 2000, a new lead emerged in the case with the arrest of Curtis Anderson, suspected of murdering a 7-year-old girl in Valo a year earlier. He confessed to the crime and was imprisoned. However, detectives harbored suspicions that he might be responsible for similar crimes. For 7 years, no concrete evidence supported this theory until Curtis reached out to the FBI. Weakened by poor health, he wanted to confess to additional crimes before his demise. His confession revealed that he had killed 13 more girls and women, including 7-year-old Amber, who vanished 6 months before Michaela. Curtis provided specific details that made investigators take his involvement seriously. Nonetheless, proving his guilt remained a daunting task, as there was no physical evidence and the victims' bodies remained unfound. Regarding Michaela's case, Curtis denied any involvement, despite his car's striking resemblance to Katrina's description. Although FBI agents planned to continue questioning him, Curtis passed away in 2012, halting the investigation. A new lead emerged when an inmate contacted the police, suggesting that his associate Lauren Herzog bore a remarkable likeness to the composite sketch of the suspect. Detectives were intrigued, given Lauren and his partner's conviction for multiple murders they committed together. Although suspected of killing 19 people, investigators could only prove some of these crimes. Notably, Lauren had taken his own life in prison a month before the inmate came forward. Undeterred, the police investigated Lauren's potential involvement. A younger photo of Lauren did resemble the composite sketch, but detectives required more concrete evidence. They proceeded to excavate a well where Lauren and his partner had disposed of their victims' bodies. The excavation yielded thousands of bone fragments, which medical experts meticulously examined. After extensive analysis, it was determined that the bones belonged to 5 different girls, but none matched Michaela's DNA. Despite excavating multiple wells, the police were unable to find any evidence linking Lauren to the case. In 2018, a significant breakthrough emerged in the case. David Mitch, a man already imprisoned for killing his 39-year-old girlfriend in 1989, was charged with the murders of 2 women in 1986 near Michaela's town. The key to this development was modern DNA analysis, which enabled investigators to link David to these crimes by analyzing biological material found under the victim's nails, something that was impossible back then. Detectives decided to investigate his possible involvement in Michaela's case and found several intriguing connections. They discovered that David was in the same area when Michaela was abducted, matching Katrina's description and driving a similar car. Since David's fingerprints were already on record, experts re-examined the partial fingerprint found on Michaela's scooter. Thanks to modern technology, they made a significant breakthrough. The fingerprint on the scooter perfectly matched David's. By 2020, the hope of Michaela being alive had faded, and David was charged with her murder. He denied his involvement, and the case went to trial in early 2023. Preliminary hearings took place, and the judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed with the trial. David's lawyer attempted to challenge the evidence, claiming that the scooter's fingerprint didn't necessarily link his client to the crime. However, given the circumstances, this argument seemed dubious, as it was apparent that the abductor had deliberately left the scooter near the car's back door to ambush her when she approached. The defense also tried to contest the murder charges, as Michaela's body was never found, implying a lack of proof of her death. However, this argument held little weight, as numerous modern cases have resulted in convictions without the recovery of the victim's body, given the substantial evidence. Furthermore, David had a history of violent crimes throughout his life. Michaela's father traveled from out of state to attend the press conference announcing the arrest of his daughter's kidnapper. Unfortunately, Michaela's mother, who had held on to hope of finding her daughter alive all these years, was unable to attend as she battled cancer. Shortly after the news of the arrest, she passed away, thanking the investigators for uncovering the truth before her life's end. The police pledged to continue searching for Michaela's remains, offering a $10,000 reward for any valuable information that could lead to her discovery. David's trial is about to start and will cover 3 separate cases: the murder of Michaela and 2 other cases where his DNA was found under the victim's fingernails. Initially, the prosecution pushed for the death penalty, but when the district attorney changed, the new one decided not to pursue it. If David is found guilty of all 3 murders, he will not receive a life sentence, but rather a prison sentence of several decades. This decision has outraged the victims, families, and garnered significant media attention, with David's lawyer being the only one to support this change. However, considering David is already 62 years old, it's unlikely he will live to see the end of even this reduced sentence. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Sherry Papapini. Sherry and Keith first met in middle school when Keith was in 7th grade and Sherry was in 8th. They shared their first kiss, and their friendship quickly blossomed into a close bond that lasted throughout their teenage years. However, as they grew older, they eventually lost touch and went their separate ways. Years later, Sherry had moved on with her life and got married to another man in 2006. However, the marriage was short-lived and ended in divorce after just 2 years. After her divorce, Sherry found herself single once again, unaware that fate was about to bring her and Keith back together. One day, Sherry unexpectedly ran into Keith, and the old spark was instantly rekindled. The time they had spent apart had brought them both growth and maturity, and they quickly realized just how much they had missed each other. They decided to give their love another chance and arranged a date, from which their connection continued to grow stronger with each passing day. Within a year of rekindling their romance, Keith and Sherry knew they were meant to be together. They got married in 2009 and started a family, having 2 children. They settled in Redding, California, where Sherry became a stay-at-home mom after quitting her job in telecommunications, while Keith continued to work at Best Buy as a member of the Geek Squad. The Papapini family appeared to have the perfect life, but on November 2, 2016, that illusion was shattered when Keith Papini came home to find his wife, Sherry, missing. Sherry's absence was unusual because she was always at home when Keith returned from work. At first, Keith thought she might have gone for a walk, but as time passed and she failed to return, he grew increasingly worried. He called the daycare center where their children attended school to see if Sherry had picked them up, but the school secretary told him she hadn't. Keith's concern for Sherry deepened, and he decided to use the Find My iPhone app on his phone to try to locate her. The app revealed that Sherry's phone was at the end of their driveway. Keith rushed outside and searched the area, only to find Sherry's phone lying on the ground with her headphones nearby. Most disturbingly, there were strands of hair tangled in the headphones. Keith immediately contacted the Shasta County Sheriff's Office, and they took Sherry's disappearance seriously from the start. The FBI was involved in the investigation from the beginning. Keith was resolute in his quest to raise awareness about Sherry's disappearance and begged for her safe return. He understood the significance of sharing Sherry's name and image with the public, so he collaborated with the media to garner support and aid in the search. The media played a crucial role in publicizing Sherry's story, and her picturesque appearance, with her blonde hair and blue eyes, captivated the nation. News outlets eagerly covered every aspect of her case, and her seemingly perfect life as a devoted wife and mother only added to the mystery surrounding her sudden vanishing. As news of Sherry's disappearance spread, the Shasta County Sheriff's Office received a flood of tips. Despite the numerous leads, however, none yielded any concrete results in the ongoing search for Sherry. As the investigation into Sherry's disappearance progressed, detectives scrutinized her phone records, searching for any leads. A thorough review of her messages revealed a contentious text exchange between Sherry and her husband, Keith, which had taken place several months earlier. The tone of this conversation sparked suspicion among the police, prompting them to consider the possibility that Keith might be implicated in Sherry's vanishing. Although Keith had now become a person of interest, he fully cooperated with the authorities, even offering to take a polygraph test in an effort to dispel any doubts about his involvement. The results of the polygraph examination ultimately cleared Keith of any suspicion. In addition to the text messages exchanged between Keith and Sherry, investigators discovered several texts on Sherry's phone from men who had used female names. Further examination suggested that Sherry was planning to leave Keith on November 10, 2016. The police located one of these men and questioned him about Sherry's whereabouts. According to the man, he had met Sherry 5 years earlier at a restaurant during a work conference she was attending. Although the man claimed he didn't know where Sherry was, he provided insight into her relationship with Keith. During the interview, the man revealed that Sherry held Keith in low regard and was afraid of him. He alleged that Keith was violent and abusive, often locking Sherry up in their home. After a man who knew Sherry accused her husband Keith of being abusive, the police launched an investigation to determine if the accusations were true. Although they questioned friends and neighbors, they found no significant evidence to suggest Keith was violent. However, during these interviews, the police discovered that Sherry had a reputation among her friends for being dramatic and seeking attention. This led them to suspect that the abuse allegations might be overstated or even fabricated. On Thanksgiving morning, November 24, 2016, just days after Sherry Papapini went missing, the police received a call at 4:32 a.m. The caller reported a woman in distress on the side of I-5, prompting the officers to rush to the scene. When they arrived, they found a woman bound with chains and zip ties. Due to her disheveled appearance, it took the officers a few moments to identify her as Sherry Papapini, who had been missing for several days. The officers were greatly relieved to discover Sherry still alive, and they immediately began freeing her from her restraints. They carefully removed her chains and zip ties, taking great care not to cause her any further harm. Once she was finally free, the officers promptly transported Sherry to the hospital so she could receive the medical attention she desperately needed. Upon her arrival at the hospital, the full extent of Sherry's terrifying ordeal became painfully clear. Her body was covered in numerous bruises. Her hair had been cut noticeably shorter, and a distinct burn mark was visible on her arm. Additionally, she had a severe rash on her arm, and her weight had plummeted to a dangerous 87 pounds. While Sherry was recovering at Woodland Memorial Hospital, the police tried to question her, but she was too distraught to provide any information. Sherry insisted that her husband Keith be present during the interview, so he was allowed to stay in the room as she described the incident. Sherry explained that she was out jogging when a dark-colored SUV, driven by two women, pulled up beside her. The older woman got out of the vehicle, pointed a gun at her, and approached her. The younger woman stayed in the car. Sherry said she was forced against her will into the back of the vehicle. Before getting in, Sherry deliberately left her phone and headphones on the driveway, along with some strands of her hair, as a signal to Keith that something was wrong. Sherry shared the details of her kidnapping with the police and her husband Keith. She explained that she kept dozing off in the back of the SUV, making it difficult to keep track of time during the journey. Sherry also mentioned that the two women had covered her face with something, preventing her from seeing her surroundings. According to Sherry, the women told her they had abducted her because a man wanted to buy her and she was being taken to meet him. However, they didn't reveal the man's identity or location. Sherry was terrified and worried about her situation, as she had no idea where she was being taken or what would happen to her while she was being held captive. Sherry alleged that one of the two women with whom she was being held captive physically abused her. This woman repeatedly hit Sherry, causing her various injuries. Sherry also claimed that this woman tattooed her right shoulder with the word Exodus, supposedly to make her more appealing to a buyer who was allegedly a police officer. Additionally, Sherry stated that her captors constantly played mariachi music, which she found disturbing and disorienting. The constant barrage of this music contributed to the oppressive atmosphere of her captivity, making it feel even more isolating. Sherry was imprisoned in a single room with a boarded-up window. She described the harsh living conditions, including a closet where she was chained. This closet doubled as a bathroom, with a bucket that she used for urination and defecation. About 3 weeks into her captivity, Sherry heard a gunshot. After that, she never saw the older Hispanic woman again, which raised many questions in her mind. Was she dead? The younger woman, who had remained silent until then, took charge. She ordered Sherry to get into a car, and they drove along I-5. The car suddenly stopped, and Sherry was startled. She looked around, trying to make sense of the situation. Then, the younger woman told Sherry to get out of the vehicle. Uncertain and frightened, Sherry cautiously obeyed. As she stepped out of the car, she felt a mix of fear and excitement. Was this her chance to escape, or was she being led into an even more dangerous situation? She was left with more questions and uncertainty. After Sherry was found safe on the side of I-5, the Shasta County Sheriff's Office held a press conference to announce her return. During the conference, the police announced that Sherry had been abducted by two women of Hispanic origin, sparking widespread concern among the public. Once settled back at home after her abduction, Sherry began attending therapy sessions. As a California resident, she became eligible for the state's Victim Compensation Fund, which uses public funds to help pay for victims' therapy in the aftermath of an abduction. Sherry subsequently spent a significant amount of time at home, avoiding going out as frequently as she had before her abduction. 1 year after Sherry was abducted, the police released a composite sketch of two Hispanic women suspected of being involved in the crime. Despite this breakthrough, no new leads emerged. Furthermore, the the police announced that they had found male DNA on Sherry's underwear, which she had on when she was discovered on the side of I-5. They clarified that this DNA sample did not belong to Sherry's husband, Keith. 2 years had elapsed since Sherry's abduction, and the police were still unable to find a match for the male DNA found on her underwear, despite their ongoing efforts. The investigation remained stagnant, with no new leads, and the case continued to go unsolved. The police investigating Sherry's case requested permission to use familial DNA techniques to identify the source of the unknown DNA evidence. This cutting-edge approach enabled them to use the existing DNA profile to find potential relatives of the donor. By analyzing DNA evidence, familial DNA testing helps investigators determine if it matches any family members of a suspect, making it a powerful tool in criminal investigations. It works by identifying genetic markers shared among family members, allowing investigators to narrow down the list of potential suspects and establish possible familial links. When the police obtained a familial DNA match on the male DNA found in Sherry's underwear, they were surprised to discover it belonged to a close relative of James Ray's, Sherry's ex-boyfriend. This breakthrough raised several questions and became a crucial turning point in the investigation, leading the police to wonder if Sherry's ex-boyfriend might have been involved in her abduction in June 2020. Investigators collected a soda bottle from James's trash and sent it to the forensic lab for DNA analysis. The lab conducted tests on the soda bottle, and, a month later, a lab technician contacted the police to inform them that James Rice's DNA matched the sample found on Sherry's underwear on the day her body was discovered. After receiving the DNA match, the police interviewed James Rice, a sports shop employee, at his home in Costa Mesa, California, about Sherry's case. James had previously dated Sherry about 10 years prior, and he claimed that the last time he saw her was a year after their breakup. He stated that he had heard rumors about her disappearance and subsequent safe return. During the police interview, James initially denied any involvement in Sherry's disappearance. However, he eventually admitted to being friends with her, despite their breakup 10 years prior. James claimed that he played a role in Sherry's disappearance, but not in her kidnapping. Instead, he said he was helping a friend in need. According to James, Sherry had contacted him, saying she was trying to escape her abusive husband, Keith. James told the police that on November 2, 2016, one of his friends had rented a car for him. The next day, he used this car to pick up Sherry. James said Sherry got into the back seat and lay down during the drive back to Costa Mesa. During her stay at James' house, Sherry mostly stayed in the bedroom, and James continued with his daily routine. Occasionally, Sherry would help with cleaning and cooking. She even boarded up the bedroom window, reportedly because she wanted the room door. While living with James, Sherry made a conscious effort to lose weight by drastically reducing her food intake. James reported to the police that Sherry had asked him to assist her in harming herself, including hitting herself hard enough to cause bruises. On one occasion, Sherry asked James to shoot a hockey puck at her knee, despite his discomfort with the request. Although he was hesitant, James ultimately agreed to participate in this harmful behavior with Sherry. James confessed to branding Sherry with the word Exodus on her right shoulder. He explained that they had bought a wood-burning tool from Hobby Lobby specifically for that purpose. One day, Sherry suddenly told James that she was leaving his house. Before she left, Sherry asked James to get chains and zip ties and instructed him to restrain her securely before driving her back to Reading, California. During the drive, Sherry told James to pull over, which he did. She then jumped out of the vehicle, and James drove away. When the police questioned James about the 2 Hispanic women Sherry claimed had kidnapped her, he denied having any knowledge of what she was talking about. However, when the police searched James's house, they were surprised to find several rooms that matched the descriptions Sherry had provided of her captivity. Notably, James's bedroom and closet closely matched a drawing Sherry had made of the rooms she was held in, and a table in James's house was similar to one Sherry had described in her initial police interviews. The police then scheduled a follow-up interview with Sherry and her husband Keith at the police station, having gathered significant evidence suggesting that Sherry had faked her own abduction. Before confronting Sherry with this evidence, the police asked if she wanted Keith to leave the room. Sherry did not respond, so the police left the couple alone for a few minutes before proceeding with the interview. During this time, Sherry confessed to Keith that she didn't want the authorities to catch the Hispanic woman who had kidnapped her. Sherry felt indebted to this woman because she had let her go, and therefore didn't want to file a complaint against her. Keith listened attentively to Sherry's reasoning, but he grew concerned as he thought she wasn't thinking clearly and was getting frightened. He stressed that regardless of Sherry's decision not to press charges, the woman would still have to face the consequences of her actions. The police re-entered the interview room, informing Sherry and Keith that they had obtained a familial DNA match on the male DNA found on Sherry's clothing. The name they mentioned was James Rise, Sherry's former boyfriend. Upon hearing the name, Keith had a physical reaction, recognizing James as Sherry's ex-partner. Police told Sherry and Keith that James, her ex, passed a polygraph test, and they believed he was telling the truth. They thought Sherry staged her abduction, citing her deliberate weight loss and a rash from cleaning supplies at James's place. They also claimed James branded her with a wooden tool from Hobby Lobby and that her broken nose was self-inflicted with a hockey stick. Sherry kept a straight face despite evidence she staged her abduction, claiming she hadn't seen James since his brother's funeral years ago. But police knew she was lying, thanks to James' insider info. On March 3, 2022, Sherry was arrested by the FBI for lying and faking her abduction. 6 weeks after arrest, Sherry signed a plea deal, admitting to orchestrating her kidnapping. She received an 18-month prison sentence and a $300,000 fine, despite her attorney's request for a shorter sentence. The judge called Sherry a manipulator and liar. He's certain she'd have kept lying if caught. He punished her to deter others, noting she exploited victims' funds, disability payments, and a GoFundMe account, getting hundreds of thousands of dollars. Sherry addressed the court during her sentencing hearing, expressing her remorse and apologizing to the numerous people who had suffered due to her actions. She openly acknowledged her guilt, stating that she was responsible for lying and bringing dishonor upon herself and those around her. In August of 2023, Sherry was granted her release and was placed in a halfway house. Keith and Sherry separated on the day she was arrested in March 2022, and a few days after Sherry pled guilty, the following month, Keith filed for divorce and also sued for full custody of their children. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Chris Coleman. On May 5, 2009, the Coleman family, who appeared to have the perfect life, was tragically murdered in their home just before 3 a.m. Let's examine the events of that night, a crime that left a lasting impact on many. Chris Coleman met his future wife, Sherry, while they were both serving in the military. For Sherry, it was love at first sight, and she knew immediately that Chris was the one she wanted to spend the rest of her life with. Within a few months of meeting, Sherry became pregnant with their first child, Garrett. As devout Christians, the couple married before Garrett was born. After Garrett's birth, Chris and Sherry had their second son, Gavin. Gavin was a lively child, whereas Garrett was more laid-back, like his father. Both boys had lively personalities and were well-behaved. Sherry was a devoted mother who would do anything to protect her sons. Chris was an excellent father, and the family enjoyed quality time together, laughing, playing, and cherishing every moment with their children. After leaving the military, the Colemans moved to Waterloo, Illinois, a small town. where they bought a house in an upscale neighborhood, courtesy of Chris's new job. Chris became the head of security for Joyce Meyer, a renowned TV evangelist and CEO of one of the world's largest Christian ministries. However, controversy arose due to Joyce's multi-million-dollar income and opulent lifestyle, which sparked criticism from some individuals. They accused her of being a greedy con artist who exploited her followers' fears, arguing that her financial success and lavish lifestyle conflicted with her religious teachings. As Joyce's bodyguard and personal security guard, Chris was responsible for monitoring and protecting her from hate mail and letters sent to her church, which often contained threats against her life, with people expressing their intentions to harm her. Chris earned a substantial salary of $100,000 per year, working for Joyce's ministry in St. Louis, Missouri, providing financial stability for his family. As part of his job as a bodyguard, Chris frequently accompanied Joyce on international trips, ensuring his safety while abroad. However, this arrangement meant Chris was away from home for extended periods, affecting his family life. One year, Chris was gone for 260 days, which took a toll on his family, especially his sons, Garrett and Gavin. The boys missed their father and would mark off each day on a calendar, eagerly waiting for his return. However, shortly after Chris came home, he would have to leave again, causing tension in his marriage to Sherry. Sherry felt overwhelmed, shouldering the responsibilities of both parents and underappreciated for managing the household alone. The constant cycle of Chris's absence strained their relationship. In October 2008, Chris visited Tampa, Florida, where his friend Sherry had gone to high school. Sherry got in touch with her old friend Tara Lintz and asked her to look out for Chris while he was in town. After settling in, Chris contacted Tara and they agreed to meet up. Tara kindly showed Chris around the city. On November 14, 2008, at around 11 p.m., Chris received a disturbing email. The sender's email address was destroychris@gmail.com, and the subject line and content terrified him. The email warned Chris to stop working for Joyce Meyer, otherwise he or his family would be killed. Over the next few hours, more threatening emails arrived at the ministry from the same sender, repeating the threat and specifying a time and date when the attack on his family might happen. The sender seemed to know Chris's schedule and was aware that he would soon be traveling out of the country. Chris told Sherry about the threatening emails he'd been getting, and on the following Monday, he went to the local police station to report them. He explained that he'd been away from home a lot lately because he'd been traveling with Joyce Meyer Ministries. The police offered to increase their patrols around the house when Chris was away. But even with the extra police presence, Sherry was still afraid for her family's safety. Sherry was so scared that she once asked a friend to stay with her because she didn't feel safe staying alone in the house when Chris was away. She made it clear that she would do whatever it took to keep her family safe. To prove how serious she was, Sherry showed her friend that she had a gun and demonstrated how to hold it, just in case someone broke into the house while Chris was away and she wasn't there. 2 months after the death threats started, a mysterious hand-delivered letter arrived in the Coleman's mailbox. The letter was written in bold letters and was very demanding. It said, "Deny your God publicly or else. No more opportunities. Time is running out for you and your family." This threat was very ominous and specific, stating that if the Colemans didn't do what the writer wanted, they would face severe consequences. Sherry was deeply shaken by the disturbing message. The fact that someone had invaded her private space and threatened her and her family made her feel genuinely terrified throughout the ordeal. Sherry's fear grew more intense by the day. The letter she received was a constant reminder of the potential danger that lurked in the shadows, waiting to pounce. After getting a death threat in the mail, Sherry and her husband Chris decided to take extra measures to protect their family. As part of their safety plan, Chris installed surveillance cameras around their home. These cameras recorded the surroundings and sent the footage to a screen in their basement office. The footage was also saved on a digital video recorder, allowing Chris to keep a permanent record of any incidents. He hoped the cameras would help him identify the person behind the threats against their family. After the cameras were installed, the threats against the Colemans stopped. Life returned to normal for Chris, Sherry, and their sons, Garrett and Gavin. For a while, everything seemed fine. In April 2009, Sherry confided in others that she was feeling more optimistic about her marriage and was determined to make it work. She was relieved the death threats had stopped and felt a sense of happiness. However, Sherry's optimism was short-lived. A second ominous letter arrived at the Coleman home, warning her that her worst fears were about to become a reality. Chris, her husband, was unsettled by the letter's contents and decided to review the previous night's footage from their security camera. What he saw shocked him. A mysterious silhouette caught his attention, but its identity remained unclear. This new discovery reignited Sherry's fear for her own and her children's safety, plunging her back into a state of constant unease. The brief sense of security she had felt was now gone, replaced by the feeling that her worst nightmare was closing in. The local police boosted their efforts due to the rising threats against the Coleman family. A neighbor, Detective Sergeant Justin Barlow from the Columbia Police Department, took a keen interest in the case. Detective Barlow personally called Chris to discuss the situation. During their conversation, Detective Barlow mentioned that he had noticed Chris's recent work absences from home. He offered help, providing his cell phone number in case Chris needed anything or had concerns. Detective Barlow reassured Chris that he could respond faster in an emergency than the regular police. Detective Justin Barlow lived across the street from the Coleman family, so he set up video cameras to monitor their driveway over several weeks. Although the cameras captured footage of the Colemans going about their daily routines, they did not capture the person responsible for leaving the death threats. Despite his efforts, the videos did not provide any clues or information about the identity of the person behind the threatening messages. On May 5, 2009, Chris went to the gym at 5:45 a.m. After leaving his house around 5:30 a.m., he called his home phone at 6:45 a.m. to check if his wife Sherry and their sons were up and getting ready for school. When no one answered, Chris became worried and called his neighbor, Detective Justin Barlow, at 6:45 a.m. to ask for his help. Chris explained to Detective Barlow that he had been trying to reach Sherry while he was at the gym, but she wasn't picking up. This made Chris increasingly concerned, so he asked Detective Barlow to check on Sherry and the boys. Detective Barlow prepared himself by grabbing his essential items, including his weapon, handcuffs, flashlight, and radio, before heading to the Coleman residence. While waiting for backup to arrive, his main goal was to make contact with Sherry and ensure everything was okay. With a mix of anticipation and apprehension, Detective Barlow approached the door and knocked firmly, hoping to get a response. However, the silence that followed made him feel uneasy. The lights inside the house were off, and there was no sign of movement, which only added to his bad feeling. Within minutes of Detective Justin Barlow's arrival at the Coleman home, a patrol vehicle pulled up with an additional officer to assist him. The second officer was sent to the rear of the house to try to see through a door or window or establish contact with Sherry or the boys at the back of the house. But as soon as the officer reached the back, he found signs of forced entry into the basement. This discovery immediately grabbed Detective Barlow's attention, and he began to suspect that someone inside the house was in danger. Detective Barlow was deeply concerned for the safety of Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin after discovering the signs of forced entry into the Coleman home. Detective Barlow and the second officer decided to enter the premises through the basement. They announced their presence, but received no response. As they thoroughly searched the basement, they found a disconnected video cable at the computer desk. This led them to conclude that the camera's digital video recorder had been taken. Detective Justin Barlow and another officer made their way up from the basement of the Coleman home, ascending the stairs to the main level. As they climbed, they noticed an increasingly strong smell of aerosol spray paint. Once they reached the top, they saw that the wall had been spray painted with derogatory messages targeting Chris, Sherry, and their sons. 13 minutes after Chris phoned Detective Justin Barlow, Chris returned home from the gym. The detective told him to wait outside while they searched the house. Chris complied, sitting quietly on the porch without asking questions or trying to enter. Meanwhile, a third officer arrived at the Coleman residence. The three officers knew they had to search the rest of the house for Sherry and her sons. As they went upstairs, they found more hate-filled messages spray-painted on the walls when they reached the second story of the Coleman home. Detective Justin Barlow entered Garrett's bedroom, the oldest son's room, and initially thought he was asleep. But when he got closer, the detective realized Garrett was dead. There were no signs of life, and his body was cold to the touch. Ligature marks around his neck indicated the young boy had been murdered by strangulation. The discovery of Garrett's lifeless body shocked Detective Barlow. In the next room, the second officer found Gavin, but to his horror, the boy was also dead, just like his brother. Gavin also had ligature marks around his neck, indicating he had been strangled. The killer had even spray-painted an obscene message on the bed sheets, making the scene even more horrific. The third officer entered the master bedroom, where he was met with a deeply disturbing scene. Sherry, like her sons, was lying lifeless across the bed, her hair scattered over her face, hiding her features. It was obvious to the officer that Sherry had been brutally murdered. As he surveyed the room, he noticed multiple bruises on Sherry's body, suggesting that she had fiercely resisted her attacker, fighting to defend herself and her sons. After Detective Justin Barlow and the officers discovered the lifeless bodies of Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin, Chris entered the house, having waited outside for news about his family. Unaware of the gravity of the situation, Chris announced his presence. Detective Barlow then had the heartbreaking task of informing Chris that his entire family had been murdered. This devastating news crushed Chris, leaving him reeling. To give Chris some privacy to process the information, Detective Barlow accompanied him outside. However, as the reality of the situation set in, Chris's reaction was overwhelming. He became nauseous, and his body seemed to weaken. Overcome with grief, Chris curled up in a fetal position, unable to contain the torrent of emotions. The shock of the tragedy was too much for him to absorb. Chris couldn't comprehend the brutal way his family had been taken from him. In desperation, Chris reached out to his father, Ronald, and informed him that something had happened to Sherry and the boys. Ronald immediately realized Chris was in shock upon receiving the news. Ronald was equally stunned, unable to believe that this tragedy had befallen his family. News of the shocking murders of Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin Coleman spread swiftly throughout Waterloo, Illinois, where the family lived. As the community awoke to the grim news, neighbors were left devastated and terrified. The Coleman family had always been perceived as the epitome of a perfect American family, with their charming sons, Garrett and Gavin, admired by everyone. In fact, one neighbor went so far as to say that everyone would want their children to be like Garrett and Gavin, who were always polite, helpful, and kind-hearted. For Sherry's brother and mother, the harsh reality of the brutal crime was impossible to accept. Chris Coleman, the husband and father, was taken to a nearby police station for questioning after his wife and two sons were discovered murdered. During the interrogation, Detective Justin Barlow asked Chris if he could shed any light on the killings. Chris expressed deep regret for leaving to go to the gym, leaving Sherry and the boys alone in the home. When Detective Barlow asked Chris if he had any idea who could have committed the murders, Chris claimed he had no idea. However, several aspects of Chris's behavior during the interview raised suspicions with the detective. One of the detective's initial concerns was Chris's lack of curiosity about the circumstances surrounding his wife and son's murder. Given the gravity of the situation, it seemed odd that Chris didn't ask questions about their deaths. Instead, he appeared uninterested in finding out the details. Additionally, the detective noticed that Chris tried to conceal scratches on his arms during the interview. He asked for a blanket, despite the warm room temperature, to hide the injuries. These scratches raised suspicions as the detective knew that Sherry, Chris's wife, had fought for her life. When questioned about the scratches, Chris claimed they resulted from installing a satellite dish the day before. During the police interview, Chris denied having an affair outside of his marriage. However, he admitted to having a close friendship with Tara, a cocktail waitress and high school friend of his wife's who lived in Florida. Chris claimed that his wife wouldn't have approved of their conversations, but he maintained that he had no intention of leaving his wife for Tara. He insisted that he would never consider betraying his family in such a way. A different story unfolded when detectives contacted Tara in Florida. Tara claimed that her relationship with Chris went beyond friendship, alleging a full-blown affair that started in November 2008. She handed over her phone and laptop to the police, which contained convincing evidence of their romance, including emails, explicit photos, and videos they had exchanged. When confronted with Tara's information, Chris confessed to seeing her more frequently than he initially admitted. Further investigation revealed that Chris and Tara had devised a secret meeting system, often coinciding with his work trips for Joyce Meyer. They would secretly meet at these locations, sometimes traveling to exotic destinations like Hawaii to spend time together away from their families. Chris claimed his relationship with Tara wasn't an affair, defining an affair as involving a deeper level of commitment and involvement than they had. However, detectives found contradictory evidence on Tara's phone and computer, including a calendar marked with a wedding to Chris and scheduled vacations, suggesting she believed he would leave his family for her. This evidence raised suspicions, contradicting Chris's assertion that their relationship was casual. Chris's father, Ronald, was shocked by the revelation, but insisted that the affair had no connection to the murders of Chris's wife and son. He described Chris as gentle and non-violent, emphasizing that he showed no signs of aggression. Detectives suspected Chris's affair with Tara was a strong motive for the murders, but their initial investigation found insufficient evidence to press charges. After 6 hours of questioning, Chris was released without charges. Tara was identified as a person of interest in the murders of Sherry Garrett and Gavin. However, detectives cleared her as a suspect after determining she was in Florida on the morning of May 5, 2009, when the family was killed. The Coleman family murders led to one of the largest murder investigations in Illinois history. A task force of 25 detectives was formed to catch the killer. For 15 consecutive days, they worked 20-hour shifts, bringing in experts to assist with the case. A key focus of the task force was tracing the source of the hate-filled emails sent to Chris Coleman. Every threatening email received by Joyce Meyer Ministries in the past year was careless of the spray paint used at the crime scene, identified the brand and color as Rust-Oleum Candy Apple Red. Investigators learned that Chris Coleman had bought this exact product at a local hardware store just days before his family was killed. One detective contacted the store manager, who confirmed the purchase and identified the specific product as Rust-Oleum Candy Apple Red spray paint. This crucial discovery linked Chris Coleman to the same type of spray paint found at the murder scene. During the investigation into the Coleman family's murder, the time of death became a crucial factor. Initially, Chris claimed to have left his home around 5:45 a.m. on May 5, 2009, the morning his family was killed. However, the medical examiner's report showed that Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin were killed around 3 a.m., indicating that Chris was at home when his family was murdered. 2 weeks after the bodies were discovered, Chris Coleman was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The prosecution's argument was that the murders were motivated by greed, selfishness, and narcissism, and that Chris had decided to eliminate his family to start anew. In April 2011, Chris Coleman's trial began, with the state accusing him of murdering his wife, Sherry, and their two sons, Garrett and Gavin. The prosecution's case was that Chris had killed his family because he wanted to be with Tara Lynn, but couldn't divorce his wife due to the potential loss of his well-paying job with Joyce Meyer Ministries, which did not condone divorce. Conversely, Chris's defense attorney argued that Chris was innocent and that an intruder had entered the home on May 5, 2009, and committed the murders. Exactly 2 years after the devastating murders of Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin, Chris Coleman was finally found guilty of the heinous crime. Although eligible for the death penalty, the judge instead sentenced Chris to life imprisonment without parole. This verdict was influenced by the state of Illinois' recent repeal of the death penalty, which was set to take effect just months after the tragic incident. Sherry's loved ones and friends were resolute in keeping her, Garrett, and Gavin's memories alive and sought to do something meaningful to honor them. They decided to raise funds for victims of domestic violence, a cause that deeply resonated with them. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Angela Craig. The Craig family, who lived in a $1 million home in the Denver suburbs, seemed like an average family with 6 kids, despite their financial struggles. However, their life took a dark turn on March 6, 2023, due to a protein shake. Angela Craig, a loving mother of 6, died suddenly on March 18, 2023, leaving her family in shock. Her husband James Craig's web of lies soon unraveled, revealing a sinister plot he had conceived to murder her. As the investigation progressed, the Craig family was appalled to discover one disturbing revelation after another, turning their seemingly normal life into a living nightmare. Angela Craig was pronounced brain dead at 4:29 p.m., but the reason behind her sudden death remained a mystery. Despite being perfectly healthy beforehand, her condition rapidly deteriorated, leaving doctors baffled. Her organs began shutting down, and it was unclear how someone who was formerly healthy and active, even taking trips to visit family members, could decline so quickly. Aurora, a charming eastern suburb of Denver, Colorado, is renowned for its outdoor activities, excellent schools, and pleasant atmosphere. The Craig family, consisting of James, Angela, and their 6 children, Oliver, Mira, Belle, Violet, Nora, and Cleo, called this town home. James and Angela, who married in 1999 when they were 20 and 21 years old, were deeply in love and eager to start a family. Originally from Dodge City, Kansas, they relocated to Denver after James completed dental school and taught at UMKC. James eventually started practicing at Summerbrook Dental, where Angela would occasionally lend a hand. Summerbrook Dental became the top choice in the region. Beyond dentistry, the Craigs were active in the LDS and Mormon Church, where Angela took on various roles, including teacher, choir director, youth organization leader, and family history consultant. Her favorite role was as a family history consultant, helping families uncover their history and perform temple ordinances on their behalf. All 6 of their children grew up and were baptized in the church, participating in all the activities. Everything seemed perfect in their lives, but appearances were deceiving. In 2019, James earned around $800,000, and they lived in a paid-off $1 million home. However, that same year, he took out loans of $675,000 and $242,000 against their house. Despite his income, the family faced financial struggles. James had taken out these loans to fix things, but they backfired. He ended up owing $315,000 to the IRS, had $200,000 in credit card debt, and over $750,000 in other debts, including poor cryptocurrency investments. The following year, his total debt ballooned to $2.2 million, forcing him to file for bankruptcy in 2022. Summerbrook Dental, where James worked, started having financial troubles and wasn't interested in keeping him employed. James realized he would have to declare bankruptcy again. But then his dental school friend Ryan intervened. Ryan bought Summerbrook Dental and officially became James's business partner. Although James and Ryan, along with their families, had always been extremely close, James began relying on Ryan for emotional support more than ever before in 2020. On March 6, 2023, James and Angela woke up early to exercise and each had a protein shake. Later that morning, Angela texted James, saying she wasn't feeling well and asked if he had added extra vitamins to her shake, as she was feeling dizzy. James replied that he had added a full scoop of caffeine and a large scoop of B vitamins and mentioned that he was feeling a bit shaky too. Angela responded that she only takes a small scoop of B vitamins. As they continued to talk, Angela told James she felt as if she had been drugged. James replied that, given their history, he knew that must be triggering and clarified that he didn't drug her. He also expressed that he was super worried and mentioned that she looked really pale before he left, particularly in her lips. After numerous tests, Angela's symptoms persisted, and she was eventually admitted to Parker Adventist Hospital. Despite the hospital's efforts, the medical professionals couldn't identify the cause of her condition, and she was sent home the same day. The next morning, James offered to take the day off from the dental clinic, but Angela, aware of their financial situation, told him to go to work, saying everything would be okay. Both Angela and James kept texting each other throughout the day. Angela thought it might be just an illness and said she would contact her primary care doctor later that day. She also sent a message saying, "I'm thinking maybe I had a sinus infection that I got used to, which then turned into an inner ear infection, and that's why it seemed to come on so suddenly." As they continued talking, Angela told James she had passed out in the kitchen earlier that day, and all she remembered was their daughter Violet screaming. James advised Angela to call 911, but she refused. James then talked to Matt about Angela's condition, and Matt thought her symptoms matched those of diabetes. Matt recommended that Angela see a new doctor as soon as possible, as she might be a newly diagnosed diabetic. However, Angela instead made an appointment with her own doctor. She even texted James, telling him not to mention diabetes and saying that she had told Matt to mind his own business. Angela scheduled an appointment for Friday, March 10th, but rescheduled for Thursday to see the doctor sooner. On the 7th, she and her husband spent the evening watching TV and cuddling, hoping for a better day ahead. The day after fainting in the kitchen, Angela began to feel better on March 8th, still oblivious to the sinister plan her husband had set in motion. However, her brief improvement was short-lived, as she started experiencing cold, fatigue, shakiness, weakness, and dizziness the following day. On March 9th, a family friend brought a glucometer to their home, and Angela's initial reading was 179. However, her levels later dropped to 140 later that day. As her symptoms persisted, she was eventually admitted to the hospital. After hearing about Angela's condition, James texted her, "Man, baby, you've got to stop scaring me like this. I love you so much, and I'm not used to all of this excitement." His words could be interpreted as either an attempt to reassure Angela and lighten the mood, or as a sarcastic response, given that his plans seemed to be working. That same day, James and Andre exchanged texts on various topics, including church, the kids, and family matters. Over the next 5 days, doctors conducted a series of tests to determine the cause of Angela's condition. The test results suggested that her symptoms were mainly related to blood pressure and vomiting. During this time, family members and friends rallied around Angela, helping with childcare, providing meals, and offering emotional support. James also sought advice from Michelle, Ryan's wife, who held a PhD in nursing and was a professor. She, too, was trying to understand what was happening to Angela, although she was unaware of James' plan, which he had set in motion on March 10th. James confided in Michelle that the uncertainty was taking a toll on him. He shared that Angela's blood pressure was a significant concern, having recently spiked to 100/60 from a previous reading of 56/44. The doctors, he said, intended to keep her under observation for another night. Notably, James expressed concern for Angela's emotional well-being, but this might have been a ploy to garner sympathy in the coming days, considering his suspected intentions. Despite his questionable motives, James demonstrated remarkable care towards Angela and the children, doing everything in his power to support them through this difficult time. On one hospital visit, he even apologized to Angela for not bringing flowers. However, this gesture could have been part of his calculated plan, aimed at deflecting suspicion from his ultimate goals. Angela remained in the hospital until March 14th, but despite the doctor's efforts, they were unable to determine the cause of her condition. She was eventually sent home with an oxygen tank and instructed to use it full-time. Upon her return, Angela jokingly texted James, saying she had become an old lady who needed an oxygen tank. The family, including the children, hoped that her return would mark the end of their trauma. Although the Craig family still lacked a diagnosis, Angela appeared to be improving. She felt stable and was no longer vomiting. However, this glimmer of hope was short-lived. On the morning of March 5th, around 11 a.m., Angela's brother rushed her back to the University of Colorado Hospital's emergency room. At this point, everyone desperately sought answers, unaware of the shocking act James had committed to cause Angela's condition. James arrived at the hospital shortly after Angela was admitted. She complained of a severe headache and dizziness. A few hours later, around 2 p.m., Angela had a seizure and her condition rapidly deteriorated. The doctors' attempts to intubate her failed, and she began to experience intracranial pressure, which affected the blood flow to her brain. Additionally, her pupils became unresponsive. Given the severity of her condition, she was transferred to the intensive care unit, ICU, and the doctors warned that her situation was dire. As James was updating Michelle on Angela's condition, sending her 2 photos and warning that her blood pressure had dropped to 55/44 and her oxygen saturation level to 84, he also mentioned that the doctors were concerned she wasn't mentally responsive as expected. Michelle and Ryan immediately rushed to the hospital to offer support, unaware that James's message would ultimately expose him. On his way to the hospital, Ryan received a call from Jacqueline, the office manager at Summerbrook Dental. She informed him that James had returned to the office after hours on March 6th, and Caitlin, another employee, had seen him using a computer in exam room 9 with the lights off. Although this might have seemed like a routine office matter, James had no reason to use that computer since he had one in his own office and often brought his laptop to work. What raised suspicions was that after leaving the office, James told Caitlin he was expecting a personal package and instructed her not to open it. On March 13th, a package arrived at the office and was opened by an unsuspecting employee who was not aware it was a personal item. The package contained a foil square with a biohazard warning and a slip with the label potassium cyanide. The employee resealed the package and handed it over to James. When Caitlin learned about Angela's condition, her suspicions were aroused and she discussed it with Jacqueline. Her suspicions were fueled by the fact that Angela's symptoms, nausea, low blood pressure, and vomiting, were similar to those Caitlin had previously experienced due to potassium cyanide poisoning. Caitlin also recalled that James had told Angela he wanted a divorce and that both were having relationship problems. She knew that James had a history of addiction to porn since his teenage years, had gambling issues, and had been involved in multiple affairs. Ryan and Michelle arrived at the hospital, each coming separately, and they spoke with James. Afterwards, Ryan approached one of the nurses and shared all the information he had gathered from Jacqueline, including his suspicion that Angela's husband might have poisoned her. Later, Ryan got a call from James, who confessed to leaking information about a package. James initially claimed the package held an engagement ring for Angela, but Ryan was skeptical and confronted him. Under pressure, James changed his story, alleging that Angela had requested he order the potassium cyanide. The autopsy and toxicology reports revealed that Angela had a toxic mix of 3 substances in her bloodstream: potassium cyanide, arsenic, and tetrahydrazine. The authorities ruled her death as a homicide, and James Craig was subsequently taken into custody, charged with first-degree murder. The police investigation into James's involvement in Angela's death included executing search warrants at his home, dental office, and personal devices. Authorities also conducted individual interviews with James and his children. Furthermore, a child protective services worker reached out to the family, during which James revealed that Angela had previously considered suicide and that he had intervened in several instances to prevent her from harming herself. James also disclosed that he had requested a divorce in December 2022, which seemed to exacerbate Angela's depression. Notably, James mentioned that Angela had overdosed on opioids, information that the caseworker was obligated to report, and speculated that her toxicology reports would reveal unusual findings. However, when questioned separately, James's children did not corroborate these claims. The eldest child, aged 20, would likely have been aware of Angela's struggles with depression and suicide attempts, yet James never sought medical or psychiatric help for her. James sent a message to Ryan expressing his disappointment that Ryan had involved the authorities. James suggested that if Ryan truly cared about him, he wouldn't have spoken to the police unless absolutely necessary. The message read, "I understand why you made that choice, but if you had approached me personally, we could have had an honest conversation. I might have shared some details that would have prevented this whole ordeal. Instead, you prioritized others' opinions and gossip over our relationship, which makes me extremely angry." The police also found text message conversations between James and his partner, Angela. In one conversation, James asked Angela not to discuss their issues with her sister. This conversation took place on March 1st, while Angela was visiting Utah. After contacting Angela's sister Tony, the police discovered that James had drugged Angela 5 or 6 years prior. According to James, he did this to prevent Angela from intervening, as he intended to give himself a fatal injection. However, no evidence was found to suggest that James had actually attempted suicide. The police subsequently interviewed the office manager at Summerbrook Dental, who relayed the story about Exam Room 9 and the personal package. The authorities then examined the computer in Exam Room 9, reviewing its search history and hard drive. On the computer, they found a Gmail account linked to James, which revealed disturbing search queries. These included: how many grams of pure arsenic are needed to kill a human? Is arsenic detectable in an autopsy? And poisons that are undetectable and show no signs of foul play. Further investigation revealed that the same Gmail account was used to purchase arsenic metal from Amazon and potassium cyanide from Sigma, specifically the product labeled 2007-81-0225G. In addition to other evidence, the police discovered records of personal communications between James and an orthodontist he had met at a conference. The two had started dating and discussed their own experiences with lengthy divorces. The woman, who cooperated with the police investigation, also flew to Colorado twice. She stated that their relationship was not serious and that she would not have dated James if she had known he was still married and living with his wife. Experts believe that the protein shakes Angela consumed were poisoned and that she was given small doses before receiving a fatal one. As of now, James has not entered a plea and has been assigned a public defender. His trial is scheduled to begin on August 8, 2024. One possible motive for the murder could be financial gain, as James is $2.2 million in debt and was the beneficiary of 3 life insurance policies held by Angela. Whether the motive was indeed money or an extramarital affair remains to be determined during the trial. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Elizabeth Smart. On June 5, 2002, 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart was asleep in her bedroom in the affluent town of Federal Heights, Salt Lake City, Utah, sharing the room with her sister Mary Catherine. As the night wore on, their peaceful slumber was shattered. A soft-spoken man, armed with a knife, forced open a window in the girl's room, disturbing Mary Catherine, who pretended to be asleep in an attempt to protect her sister. The intruder then turned to Elizabeth, ordering her to remain silent, threatening to harm her if she didn't comply. Fearing for her life, Elizabeth obeyed, putting on shoes before being taken outside the house. Meanwhile, Mary Catherine lay still for 2 hours, waiting for the perfect moment to alert her parents, Ed and Lois Smart. When she finally woke them up, she told them that someone had taken Elizabeth, but her parents were initially skeptical, thinking their daughter might have been dreaming. However, as the events began to unfold, they took Mary Catherine's story seriously. After inspecting Elizabeth and Mary Catherine's bedroom, Ed and Lois found a cut window screen, which corroborated Mary Catherine's story. Concerned for Elizabeth's safety, Ed and Lois promptly notified the authorities. The police arrived at the Smart family home and questioned Mary Catherine about the man who had abducted Elizabeth from their bedroom. Mary Catherine described the abductor as having dark hair on his arms and the backs of his hands. Although the man had spoken quietly to Elizabeth during the incident, Mary Catherine could still identify his voice as somehow familiar, even though she couldn't recall any specific occasion when she had heard it before. About 3.5 hours after Elizabeth was taken, the authorities used the Rachel Alert system to broadcast information about her abduction to the public. The Rachel Alert, named after a Utah girl who was abducted and murdered, enabled the authorities to rapidly disseminate information to a wide audience and enlist the public's help in locating Elizabeth. The police investigated people who had toured the Smart family's home, which was up for sale, as potential suspects in Elizabeth's abduction since she had been taken from her bedroom on June 5, 2002. Additionally, they searched the family's computer, seeking any online interactions Elizabeth may have had with strangers, as this was a common tactic used in child abduction cases. The day after Elizabeth's kidnapping, her devastated parents, Ed and Lois, made a heartfelt and emotional appeal on national television, pleading for her safe return. Ed addressed the perpetrator directly, his voice filled with desperation and love, asking them to bring their daughter home. With tears in his eyes, he begged the person responsible to have mercy and return Elizabeth safely, expressing his immense love for his daughter and his unwavering commitment to finding her. In Federal Heights, the police interviewed Elizabeth's neighbors, but none of them reported seeing or hearing anything unusual on the day she was abducted. The lack of information was surprising to the police, who had hoped to gather more leads to aid the investigation. Following Elizabeth's abduction, Rocky Anderson, the mayor of Salt Lake City, made a public announcement offering an initial reward of $10,000 for her safe return to her family. This amount was later increased to $250,000. A massive search effort was launched, with nearly 12,200 volunteers joining Elizabeth's family and friends to look for her. However, at a news conference, the police admitted that despite receiving thousands of tips, their progress in the case was limited. The authorities in Salt Lake City solicited assistance from other police departments statewide, but lacked crucial evidence, such as a vehicle description, to pursue significant leads. As a result, the investigation into Elizabeth's disappearance stagnated, causing frustration among law enforcement officials. Captain Scott Atkinson of the Salt Lake City Police Department publicly stated that all individuals were still suspects in Elizabeth's abduction, while reaffirming that her family was not the primary focus of the investigation. A volunteer searching for Elizabeth reported a suspicious man to the police after spotting him in a wooded canyon. The volunteer described the man's suspicious behavior, prompting the police to launch an overnight search. Despite their efforts, they couldn't find the man and eventually dismissed the tip as not credible. The police also received a tip from a local milkman in Federal Heights. He claimed to have seen a man driving an older gray Honda or Nissan on Elizabeth Street a day or two before her disappearance. The milkman said he felt uneasy about the driver and wrote down the license plate number. However, when the police checked their database for the license plate number, they couldn't find any relevant information or leads, so they dismissed the tip as not viable. The police officers investigating Elizabeth Smart's abduction faced a significant challenge due to the large number of people who gathered at the Smart residence in the hours immediately following her abduction. When the police arrived at the scene around 4 a.m., they found the home already crowded with people, which compromised the integrity of any potential evidence. As the search for Elizabeth Smart continued, the police questioned a man who had interacted with her at a social event prior to her abduction. However, they soon cleared him of any suspicion and determined he had no involvement in her disappearance. The search efforts intensified, with over 20 volunteer pilots flying their private planes over the Salt Lake area, but unfortunately, these efforts yielded no results. Tracking dogs picked up a scent in Red Boot Canyon, several miles from Elizabeth's home, but police searched the area and found nothing. The search for Elizabeth had taken a toll on her father, Ed Smart, who was on the verge of exhaustion. He collapsed from the strain and was taken to the hospital, but was released a few hours later and continued searching for his daughter. Ed and his wife, Lois, were utterly exhausted, unable to sleep, and barely holding on. In a media interview, Ed expressed his frustration and determination to find Elizabeth, stating that they were holding on to hope that their daughter was alive and would soon return home to them. Despite their exhaustion, Ed and Lois Smart remained hopeful that Elizabeth would come back to them. Elizabeth's mother, Lois Smart, publicly declared her love and devotion to her daughter through a heartfelt statement to the media, saying, "Elizabeth, if you can hear us, we love you." Her loved ones gathered for a candlelight vigil, praying for her safe return home. Following Elizabeth's abduction, the police asked her father, Ed, to take a polygraph test, which he willingly agreed to, demonstrating his family's cooperation in aiding the authorities to locate their daughter. The investigation subsequently ruled out the possibility that Elizabeth had staged her own disappearance and confirmed that she did not run away. Police got a tip about Brett Michael Edmonds, who was sighted in Federal Heights around Elizabeth's abduction time. They looked for him, but couldn't find him. He'd moved to New Mexico and Texas. After a chase, they caught a guy who looked like him, but it wasn't him. The police eventually located Brett Michael Edmonds in West Virginia, where he had been hospitalized due to an overdose and liver failure. Although his health was critical, and there were fears he might not survive, his condition stabilized enough to allow authorities to question him about Elizabeth's abduction. In a fortunate turn of events, Brett was conscious, alert, and able to speak, enabling the police and FBI agents to interview him. During the interview, Brett fully cooperated with the authorities, who ultimately concluded that he was not involved in Elizabeth's abduction. After Brett Michael Edmonds was cleared as a suspect in Elizabeth's abduction, police turned their attention to 48-year-old Richard Albert Ritchie. Elizabeth's father, Ed Smart, informed police that he had employed Richard at his home for 2 months the previous year. Ed said that since Richard didn't own a vehicle, they made a deal. Ed would give Richard his 1990 Jeep Cherokee in exchange for his labor. However, Ed was unaware that Richard Ritchie was a career criminal, and he later stated that if he had known about Richard's background, he wouldn't have hired him. Richard Ritchie's criminal history dates back to 1973, when he was convicted of second-degree felony burglary, marking the start of a string of offenses over several decades. In 1981, he was convicted of burglary for a separate incident. His most serious crime occurred in 1983, when he was sent to prison for aggravated robbery and attempted murder after wounding a police officer during a gunfire exchange with authorities during a drugstore robbery. Additionally, Richard Ritchie was convicted of theft in 1996 for stealing approximately $2,500 worth of food from a food pantry in Richfield. Corrections records show that Richard Ritchie was paroled in September 2000. In a media interview, Ed Smart expressed doubts about Richard Ritchie's involvement in his daughter Elizabeth's abduction. Despite Ritchie's criminal history, Ed initially thought him a capable worker. On June 14, 2002, Richard Ritchie was arrested for a parole violation. The police could not confirm his whereabouts on the day Elizabeth was abducted. Richard Ritchie denied any involvement through his attorney and stated that the police had thoroughly searched his home, including digging up his garden. Despite this, no evidence related to Elizabeth's abduction was found. Ritchie claimed he fully cooperated with the police, providing blood samples for DNA comparison and sitting through 26 hours of interviews. He also handed over his vehicle for investigation. By July 2002, Elizabeth Smart had been missing for a month, and her family was desperate for her return. When police received a report of a girl matching Elizabeth's description in Nebraska under suspicious circumstances, they thought their prayers had been answered. A gas station witness reported seeing a crying girl, aged 12 to 14, who seemed to be held against her will in a minivan. The witness provided a detailed description that matched Elizabeth's appearance. This news sent shockwaves through the Smart family, who eagerly hoped for any lead that might help find their missing daughter. However, a thorough police investigation revealed that the report was unrelated to Elizabeth's abduction. Despite a thorough search, police found no evidence linking the sighting to Elizabeth's case. This disappointment left the Smart family struggling with mixed emotions as they continued to hope for Elizabeth's safe return while acknowledging the possibility of false leads. Undeterred, the Smart family remained determined to find Elizabeth, maintaining a cautious optimism. They refused to rule out the possibility that the girl at the gas station was Elizabeth, but stated that they needed to keep an open mind. The family spokesperson clarified that while they weren't necessarily holding out hope that it was Elizabeth, they would be overjoyed if it were. Richard Ritchie, the main suspect in Elizabeth's disappearance, was charged with theft and burglary in two separate incidents. One incident occurred on April 4, 2001, when he allegedly stole items from a house in the Federal Heights neighborhood, which is a second-degree felony and a Class A misdemeanor. The other incident happened on June 6, 2001, when he allegedly stole jewelry and a perfume bottle valued at approximately $3,500 from the Smart family home, which is a third-degree felony. Ritchie pleaded not guilty to these charges. The stolen items were not related to Elizabeth's kidnapping investigation. Salt Lake District Attorney David Yoakum announced the charges at a press conference, stating that Ritchie had denied the theft allegations and was subsequently fired from his job. In August 2002, the police investigation into Elizabeth Smart's abduction hit a major roadblock when Richard Ritchie, their best lead, died from a severe brainstem injury that caused bleeding. Ritchie's condition worsened rapidly, leaving him unable to communicate or breathe on his own. His family made the painful decision to take him off life support in a last-ditch effort to save his life. Although doctors operated to remove a blood clot from his brain and relieve pressure on his brainstem, the damage was too extensive and their efforts were in vain. Despite this setback, the authorities persisted in their search for Elizabeth Smart's abductor. However, Ritchie's death posed a significant obstacle to the investigation, undermining confidence in other leads and hindering progress in the case. In August 2002, a horrific crime was committed when an 11-year-old girl was taken from her bedroom and subjected to sexual assault and brutal beating. The severity of her injuries was appalling, with every bone in the middle of her face broken, as revealed by hospital doctors. She required surgery, but sadly, her condition remained critical after the attack. The police investigation led to the arrest of Javier Sickler, a close friend of the girl's father, who was charged with aggravated burglary, aggravated assault, and attempted murder. Javier Sickler claimed that he remembered knocking on the front door of the victim's home, but alleged that he lost consciousness afterward. Despite initial similarities with the Elizabeth Smart abduction case, the police established that Javier Sickler was not involved in her kidnapping. As the search for Elizabeth Smart dragged on, the police began to explore unconventional approaches. They consulted psychics, individuals claiming to possess extrasensory perception that could uncover clues about her location. One tip from these psychics suggested that Elizabeth might be buried in a crypt in the foothills above Salt Lake City. This prompted a Seattle-based company to step forward, claiming that over a dozen of its members had pinpointed Elizabeth's body using a technique called technical remote viewing. According to these individuals, their psychic powers had revealed that Elizabeth was killed within hours of her abduction. However, when the police investigated the alleged tomb, they found no evidence of Elizabeth's whereabouts. In November 2002, Walter Kenneth Holloway was arrested after claiming to be the kidnapper of Elizabeth Smart and demanding a $3 million ransom from her parents, Ed and Lois Smart. Holloway contacted the Smart family and the Salt Lake Police Department, threatening to harm Elizabeth if he didn't receive the money. However, the police tracked him down to South Carolina and found no evidence linking him to her abduction. Ed Smart was outraged by the extortion scheme, which he felt diverted police attention away from finding his daughter and wasted resources that could have been used to locate her. In October 2002, Elizabeth's sister Mary Catherine had a sudden realization. The voice of the abductor was identical to that of Emmanuel, an unemployed man the family had briefly hired to work on their roof and rake leaves in their yard. Although the police were initially skeptical, due to the short duration of Emmanuel's employment with the family, the long delay between the abduction and Mary Catherine's revelation, and her limited exposure to the abductor's voice, the family decided to have a sketch artist draw Emmanuel's likeness based on their descriptions. The resulting sketch was finally released in February 2003 and received widespread media attention, featuring on prominent television shows such as Larry King Live and America's Most Wanted. Relatives of a man named Brian David Mitchell identified a suspect drawing released by the police. They provided contemporary photographs of him, which helped authorities verify that the sketch was an accurate likeness. On March 12, 2003, two couples in Sandy, Utah, recognized Brian David Mitchell walking with a woman and a girl who they knew from the news as the missing girl's abductor. The woman accompanying Mitchell was later identified as his wife, Wanda Berry. The couples quickly called the police, and officers were sent to the location. After questioning, the missing girl from Salt Lake City, Elizabeth Smart, was confirmed to be present. The officers then rescued her and arrested both Mitchell and Berry. Elizabeth provided a shocking account of being abducted, abused, and held captive. Brian David Mitchell had taken her from her home to an encampment outside Salt Lake City. The camp was a makeshift shelter hidden by dense foliage for camouflage. There, she met Wanda Barzy, Mitchell's wife, who played a significant role in her captivity. At first, Wanda Barzy acted like a caring mother figure, offering Elizabeth comfort and warmth. However, as the weeks passed, Barzy's behavior changed dramatically. She began controlling Elizabeth, forcing her to follow their strange religious beliefs. Barzy demanded that Elizabeth pray, read scriptures, and take part in religious rituals. Elizabeth faced a highly traumatic experience during her captivity when she was forced to marry Brian David Mitchell against her will. Wanda Barzy threatened her with physical harm if she refused to comply with their demands. The wedding ceremony, which Mitchell pretended was a symbol of eternal love, was actually a sham with no legal validity, serving only to reinforce Brian David Mitchell's control over Elizabeth. After forcing Elizabeth into marriage, Brian David Mitchell began assaulting her. He claimed he was a Davidic king, tasked by a higher power to kidnap virgins to fight the Antichrist, as a justification for his actions. During her captivity, Elizabeth suffered unimaginable abuse, including being chained to a tree with a metal cable that severely restricted her movement and prevented her from escaping. In addition to physical restraint, Elizabeth was also subjected to psychological manipulation. She was forced to take the new name Esther, inspired by the biblical figure, which symbolized the loss of her identity and the control exerted over her by Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee. Elizabeth was repeatedly sexually assaulted by Brian David Mitchell, leaving her traumatized and fearful. She was also forced to look at explicit magazines, further worsening her trauma and degradation. Throughout her ordeal, Elizabeth was constantly threatened with violence and even death, leaving her in a perpetual state of fear and anxiety. To weaken Elizabeth's resistance, Mitchell frequently forced her to consume alcohol and take drugs, exploiting these substances to break down her defenses and make her more susceptible to his control. The constant intoxication left her disoriented, vulnerable, and disconnected from reality, making it easier for her captors to commit their atrocities. Moreover, Elizabeth was subjected to starvation and fed scraps by her captors. After her rescue, Elizabeth described Wanda Barzee as the most evil woman she had ever encountered. Following years of legal proceedings, Wanda Barzee pleaded guilty to all charges related to Elizabeth's abduction and was sentenced to concurrent 15-year terms in state and federal prison in 2016. Her federal imprisonment was eventually terminated, and she was transferred from the Federal Medical Center Carswell in Fort Worth, Texas, to the Utah State Prison in Draper, Utah, to begin serving her state prison sentence. Elizabeth Smart spoke out against the release of Wanda Barzee in September 2018, despite which Barzee was still set free. At the time, Smart, an advocate for child safety, expressed concern that Barzee still posed a threat to others, citing her lack of remorse and signs of rehabilitation. The controversy surrounding Barzee's release drew media attention and highlighted ongoing concerns about the parole of convicted criminals. After years of legal battles, Brian David Mitchell was sentenced to life imprisonment for kidnapping Elizabeth Smart. During the hearing, Elizabeth addressed her kidnapper directly, delivering a powerful and emotional statement. She described the pain and trauma he had inflicted, telling him that the 9 months in captivity had taken an irreplaceable part of her life. Despite this, Elizabeth showed remarkable resilience and determination, vowing to lead a good life despite the darkness he had brought into her life. Her words reflected her strength and determination to overcome her challenges. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Jamie Melgar. Sandra Melgar often lies in her small prison cell, reflecting on the unexpected turns her life has taken. She never thought she'd become a widow and a suspect in her husband's murder. It's unbelievable that a year and a half after his death, a grand jury indicted her, and nearly 5 years later, a jury convicted her based on circumstantial evidence alone, with no clear motive or physical proof linking her to the crime. At 59, every day since her husband's passing has been a living nightmare. In a recent interview, Sandra said that she still catches herself thinking she'll go back home. Her blue eyes were red and puffy as tears streamed down her pale cheeks. She mentioned wanting to tell him things, forgetting he's gone. It doesn't feel like he's really gone. It's like he's temporarily away or on a trip. She added that she tries not to dwell on it, before pausing tearfully. Sandra has been incarcerated at the William P. Hobby Unit, a women's prison in rural Texas, for the past 10 months. Despite her circumstances, she has managed to stay connected with her friends and family, many of whom remain convinced of her innocence. She regularly talks to her daughter, Elizabeth Liz Melgar Rose, although the noisy prison atmosphere and her soft voice often make their conversations difficult. Sandra also keeps in touch with her friends through letters, and they update her on her Pomeranian, Lola, who was present at her house on the night of the incident. Most weekends, Liz's mother, Sandra, gets to spend a couple of hours with a rotating group of friends and family, thanks to the efforts of one of her closest friends, who coordinates these weekly visits. Liz acts as her mother's strongest advocate, taking it upon herself to speak on her behalf and passionately discussing what she sees as a grave injustice that has taken a devastating toll on her mother's life, depriving her of both her husband and her own freedom. Sandra is haunted by the memories of the fateful night of December 23, 2012, when her husband met his tragic end. Her inability to recall the events of that night has sparked suspicions among investigators who find it suspicious. Despite this, Sandra remains resolute in her assertion that she did not commit the crime. As Sandra lies in her prison cell, her thoughts often wander back to the evening she and Jamie had celebrated their 32nd wedding anniversary on December 23, 2012. That night, Sandra Melgar was jolted awake by the incessant barking of their dogs, her vision blurred as she struggled to orient herself in the dimly lit room. Her body ached and her head throbbed as she lay on the closet floor, her hands and feet bound behind her back, her undergarments soiled. Sandra, at 5 feet 4 inches tall, attempted to stretch out her legs and roll over to look through a gap under her closet door. However, her bindings and the 2 hip replacements she had undergone restricted her movement. Even if she could manage to free herself, a chair had been placed in front of the door to block her access, with the door handle inaccessible from the outside. Inside the bedroom closet, Sandra's husband of 32 years, Jamie Melgar, lay dead, with 31 stab wounds on his hands and chest. The previously white walls of the closet were now stained with blood, and a gray telephone cord had been used to bind his feet together. A medical examiner's report confirmed that Jamie's injuries were all defensive wounds, indicating that he had fought back against his attacker rather than trying to escape. A particularly vicious blow had almost severed his right thumb, which likely caused the extensive blood spatter found in the closet and bedroom. The bedroom was in disarray, with dresser drawers open and contents scattered everywhere. Clothes, books, and pill bottles littered the floor. Sandra's black purse and red wallet had been rummaged through, and their contents were spread out on the blood-stained white comforter. A small white medic stool at the foot of the bed had bloodstains on it, suggesting it had been used as a makeshift surface for the attacker's knife. The back of a nearby wooden chair was also stained with blood. In the jacuzzi bathtub, where Sandra and Jamie had celebrated their 32nd wedding anniversary the night before, several items bore witness to the tragic events. These included a white blouse, a green towel, and a silver chef knife with a 6-inch blade, all stained with blood droplets. The police later identified this knife as the murder weapon, which had been used just hours before the horrific events unfolded. Sandra and Jamie had been celebrating their 32 years of marriage with a romantic dinner at their favorite Mexican restaurant. They had planned to continue their celebration in a relaxing way, with a jacuzzi session accompanied by candles, cocktails, strawberries, and whipped cream. Even after more than 3 decades together, their love for each other remained strong, as Sandra would later tell the authorities. The couple's journey began during their senior year at Lamar High School. Jamie, with his unruly black hair and a somewhat awkward teenage mustache, was immediately drawn to the 17-year-old Sandra, who had blue eyes and blonde hair and sat in front of him in class. At first, Sandra resisted Jamie's advances for weeks, but she eventually agreed to join him and a group of friends for ice skating. Unbeknownst to her, Jamie had orchestrated the whole event, and when she arrived, only Jamie and his best friend were there. The others had mysteriously disappeared. Jamie's charming nature, humor, and penchant for corny jokes eventually won Sandra over. She admired his intelligence, thoughtfulness, and sense of humor, while Jamie appreciated her intelligence, down-to-earth personality, and lack of pretentiousness. They soon became inseparable, and in 1980, 2 years after graduating from high school, they got married in a courthouse ceremony in downtown Houston. On the anniversary of their union, Sandra and Jamie spent a romantic evening in their jacuzzi, reminiscing about their shared history and dreaming of their future together. They discussed selling their home to embark on a world tour, visiting iconic destinations like the Grand Canyon and Ireland, and witnessing the breathtaking Northern Lights. With Jamie's retirement as a computer programmer with the Houston Independent School District just 5 months away, they envisioned buying a beachfront property where they could settle down after their travels. As they chatted, they took turns giving each other massages, culminating in a romantic moment of intimacy. After 2 blissful hours in the jacuzzi, their peaceful evening was abruptly interrupted by their dogs barking. Jamie got out of the jacuzzi, wrapped a towel around himself, and put on Sandra's slippers to attend to the dogs. Little did Sandra know that this would be the last time she would see her husband alive. When Sandra woke up approximately 15 hours later, she was horrified to find herself bound and gagged in her closet, her hands and feet tied, her body sore, and her undergarments soiled. Jamie was nowhere to be found, and the frantic barking of their dogs was now accompanied by unfamiliar voices inside her home. Sandra screamed out in desperation. Herman Melgar stood outside his brother Jaime's house, confused, just after 4:30 p.m. His brother had invited him and his family for dinner, but now, despite ringing the doorbell and calling, there was no response from Jaime or his wife Sandra. What struck Herman as unusual was that Jamie's black truck was parked in the driveway and Sandra's silver car was inside the open garage. He told his family to wait by the front door while he took a look around the backyard, glancing over the fence. Noticing the plastic tarp hanging from the pergola on the back porch, Herman remembered that Jamie had been working on various home improvement projects. Returning to the front yard, Herman decided to check the laundry room door inside the garage. To his surprise, the door was unlocked, so he entered the house. As he stepped inside, Herman was met with an unsettling atmosphere. The house was dimly lit, gray and stuffy, with all the blinds drawn shut. The dogs were barking and jumping around, which added to the eerie feeling that Herman's daughter Marissa would later describe as unsettling. It was at that moment that they heard muffled screams. Herman rushed to the back of the house and found a large chair propped against the bathroom closet door. Inside the closet, Sandra lay on the floor, wearing a black satin nightgown, desperately screaming for help. Herman and his wife Maria struggled to remove the tightly bound restraints from Sandra's arms and legs. Herman got a pair of scissors from the bathroom to help free her. Meanwhile, Sandra kept asking about Jamie's whereabouts. She had visible bruises on her arms, including a dark one on her left bicep. After they finally freed her, Sandra rushed into the bedroom and found Jamie's lifeless body protruding from the closet. She checked for a pulse, but it was clear from his cold, pale, and naked body that he had passed away. Sandra covered Jamie's body with a blue jacket, and Maria escorted her back to the bathroom. When the paramedics arrived, Sandra was in hysterics, making it difficult for her to communicate with Stephanie Roberts, the first paramedic to arrive on the scene. Roberts's report stated that Sandra was in shock, cried periodically, and had lost all sense of time. Her last memory was of around 1 a.m. that morning, unaware that 15 hours had passed and it was now evening. The police documented bruises on Sandra's hands and arms, as well as a small scratch on her left thumb, but found no blood on her. Sandra told the police that after Jamie let the dogs in, she got out of the bathtub and went to her closet to get dressed. Her next memory was waking up in the closet at an unknown time, and at some point she screamed for help, but then fell back asleep, possibly having a seizure. Sandra had several underlying medical conditions, including lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, and grand mal seizures, which had forced her to resign from her job as a licensed vocational nurse. She believed she could no longer perform her duties effectively due to her seizures. In the weeks leading up to Jamie's murder, Sandra had experienced auras, which she knew were warning signs of an impending seizure. During these seizures, she would sleep for hours and wake up in a state of confusion, disorientation, and severe pain. As crime scene investigators carefully searched the house, Sandra was taken to an interrogation room at the Harris County Sheriff's Office. She mentioned that the room was too cold and was subsequently asked to take a polygraph test. Sergeants Cazal and Douay questioned her for 3 hours, focusing on the 36 hours leading up to Jamie's death. Sandra spoke quietly and complained of a headache during the interrogation. She remembered some details clearly, such as removing her boots in the bedroom, changing in the bathroom, and recalling their conversation in the jacuzzi. However, she struggled to remember other details, and her recollection of time was imprecise. When questioned about the timeline, Sandra initially stated that Jamie had left her for 15 minutes to let the dogs in before she got out of the jacuzzi. Later, she suggested it might have been around 5 minutes. Sandra admitted that she was not good at estimating time and was making an educated guess. 2 days after the murder, Liz met with Cazal and Douay to report that several items were missing from the house, including a TV from the bedroom and Sandra's medication bottles of hydrocodone and phenobarbital. She reminded them that a backpack containing a gaming system and games had been left in the garage, which she had previously mentioned to detectives. Liz also shared information about her mother's seizures and health issues, expressing her concern for her mother's fragile state and possible post-traumatic stress. Although she hoped that something might trigger a memory later, this meeting did not yield any significant breakthroughs. Liz continued to follow up with phone calls, even pointing out damage to one of her parents' rental homes. However, the authorities eventually stopped responding to her inquiries, leaving both Liz and Sandra unaware of the investigation's progress. A year and a half after the incident, Sandra was secretly indicted for Jamie's murder by a grand jury in July 2014. Because of state law, grand jury proceedings are confidential, keeping the public unaware of the discussions and evidence presented during the process. Despite the indictment, Sandra's case progressed slowly over the next 3 years, involving at least 4 prosecutors from the district attorney's office, until it was assigned to Colleen Barnett in May 2017. Colleen Barnett had rejoined the DA's office in January of that year, following a 4-year break during Kim A's tenure as district attorney. Throughout her 24-year career, Barnett had built a reputation as a diligent and fair-minded prosecutor, according to both her colleagues and the attorneys who had opposed her in court. She had handled over 70 murder trials, including the high-profile capital murder case of Suzanne Basso, who was executed for luring a mentally disabled man to Texas with the promise of marriage and then killing him. Barnett knew that Sandra's case was tough. There was no clear motive, no confession, and no direct evidence linking Sandra to the crime. Despite the challenges, Barnett was convinced of Sandra's guilt. During the 13-day trial that began in August 2017, Barnett presented Sandra as a cold-blooded killer who carefully planned Jamie's murder, luring him into their bedroom with the promise of sex. Barnett told the jury that Sandra had used a gray telephone cord to tie Jamie's feet, then fatally stabbed him from chest to neck. The prosecutor highlighted the discovery of a bag of sex toys on the bed, which Sandra later claimed was a joke gift from a friend. Although Barnett couldn't exactly say why Sandra did it, she offered several possible motives, including Jamie's life insurance policy with HISD and Sandra's alleged desire to end their marriage. However, as a Jehovah's Witness, Sandra's religion did not allow divorce. Sandra's attorney, George Ma Sechrist, a well-established and respected legal expert, presented a contrasting image of the seemingly fragile woman sitting at the defense table. According to Sechrist, Sandra was a victim of investigators who had jumped to conclusions, forming a theory within 2 hours of arriving at the crime scene. He backed this claim by pointing out that they had initially attempted to file murder charges while the crime scene investigators were still processing her home. Sechrist emphasized the lack of physical evidence linking Sandra to the crime, highlighting the fact that her blood was not found at the scene and that she had no cuts on her hands. He offered an alternative explanation. Sandra had been the victim of a home invasion, during which she suffered a head injury and was bound in her closet while the intruders killed her husband. For the jurors watching Barnett and Seacrest in the courtroom, the atmosphere was likened to a high-stakes boxing match, as the two lawyers clashed in a battle of wits. Barnett landed a significant blow with the help of Celestina Rossi, a blood spatter expert and crime scene reconstructionist from the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office. Rossi testified that the evidence at the crime scene contradicted the idea of a home invasion. She highlighted several key points, including the absence of signs of forced entry, the untouched dresser drawers in the bedroom, and a lit candle on Jamie's nightstand, which suggested that no struggle had occurred near the closet where Jamie died. Rossi explained that most of the blood was confined to the closet, with a few exceptions, such as spatter on the back of a chair, the white medical stool, and tiny droplets on the comforter. According to Rossi, this spatter was likely caused by the injury to the artery near Jamie's thumb. Rossi concurred with the medical examiner's report, stating that all of Jamie's wounds were defensive in nature. She also noted that Jamie's loaded handgun was inches from his body in the closet, untouched. Rossi emphasized that in a situation like this, one's instinct is to try to disarm their attacker rather than shoot them, even if they are approaching with a knife. After 8 hours of deliberation spanning several days, the jury, comprising 8 men and 4 women, reached a guilty verdict for Sandra on the charge of murder, sentencing her to 27 years in prison. Although this sentence was shorter than the maximum possible 99 years, it was still a significant sentence. In explaining their decision, the jury foreman later stated that by the time Sandra would be released, she would be in her early 70s and might have the opportunity to see her grandchildren, adding that they considered this decision humane as they did not view Sandra as a threat to society. When District Judge Kelly Johnson announced the verdict, Sandra let out a loud shriek and nearly collapsed into her chair. The courtroom, filled with supporters who had been convinced that the trial was merely a formality to prove Sandra's innocence, was left in stunned disbelief. Despite attempts to reassure Sandra that everything would turn out fine, perhaps to boost their own morale, the reality of the situation suddenly became clear, and everything fell apart. Sandra, clad in a red blazer and relying on a cane, was escorted out of the courtroom, where she paused to share a final emotional hug with Liz. Once they released each other, Liz crumpled to the floor, overwhelmed by grief. Having lost both her father and mother to a justice system she felt had failed them catastrophically, Liz was left feeling utterly alone and devastated. The jury foreman staunchly defended the prosecution's case, arguing it was the most plausible explanation, despite being rooted in speculation and theory. He highlighted the discrepancies in Sandra's account and questioned the legitimacy of her alleged seizure that night. While he conceded it was possible the jury had erred, he ultimately stood by their verdict. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Jackie Vandergriff. Jacqueline "Jackie" Vandergriff was born on March 4, 1992, in Carrollton, Texas. As the youngest of 2 daughters, she grew up in the Colony, Frisco, Texas, surrounded by a loving family. From a young age, Jackie exhibited a natural talent for gymnastics. Before she could walk, she was already somersaulting, and her parents recognized her potential at just 3 years old. They enrolled her in gymnastics courses, and over the following years, she refined her skills and enthusiastically participated in various competitions. She eventually reached level 5 in the Texas State Gymnastics Association. Those who knew Jackie characterized her as a warm and compassionate person with a heart of gold. She genuinely cared about the well-being of others and was a loyal friend who inspired her loved ones to be the best versions of themselves. The comfort and joy she brought to those around her were palpable. Her kindness extended beyond human relationships, as she had a deep love for animals, was a lifelong vegetarian, and believed in supporting pet adoption from no-kill shelters. Jackie's passion for reading was unmatched, with the Harry Potter series ranking high on her list of favorites. Immersing herself in the magical world of Hogwarts was a regular escape for her. Besides reading, Jackie had a deep affection for music, boasting an eclectic taste that spanned from Pink to James Taylor and Rob Thomas. Her love for musicals was particularly strong, with Rent being a favorite she would attend every local performance of. After graduating from Wakeland High School in Frisco, Jackie went on to pursue a career in cosmetology at the Paul Mitchell School. She successfully completed her training and earned her license as an esthetician. Not one to rest on her laurels, Jackie opted to further her education at Texas Woman's University, where she majored in nutrition and food science. She firmly believed that good nutrition was essential and advocated for everyone's access to proper nourishment. Her ultimate vision was to educate others about the significance of healthy eating, empowering them to make informed choices. Jackie Vandergriff seemed destined for greatness, a college junior on track to achieve her dreams and make a positive impact on the world. However, a chance encounter with an evil person in the summer of 2016 would devastate her life forever. On Wednesday, September 14, 2016, shortly after dawn, a Grapevine Police Department officer in Grapevine, Texas, received a distressing call. The caller reported finding a body near Grapevine Lake. When the officer arrived at the scene, they found a scorched area with a plastic blue kiddie pool containing a badly burned body. The body was charred beyond recognition, making it impossible to determine its identity, age, or gender. The badly burned remains of a body were taken to the medical examiner's office, where fingerprint identification later confirmed that they belonged to 24-year-old Jackie Vandergriff. As detectives investigated Jackie's final hours, they discovered that she was last seen in Denton, near the college, where she had visited two bars, Fry Street Public House and Shots and Crafts. The autopsy conducted by the medical examiner revealed the shocking extent of Jackie's injuries. She had been killed, dismembered, decapitated, and set on fire. Most disturbingly, her killer had removed her heart. As news of Jackie's brutal murder spread throughout Denton, detectives began receiving tips from people claiming to have seen a suspicious man near the crime scene, where a fire had been set. The detectives eventually obtained CCTV footage from the two bars Jackie had visited around the time of her death. At 7 p.m., a man entered the Fry Street Public House, where he sat at the bar and had a drink. An hour later, Jackie arrived and struck up a conversation with the bartender and the man. Security footage captured their interaction, providing valuable clues about their possible connection. After spending about 45 minutes at the Fry Street Public House, Jackie posted a tweet at around 8:45 p.m., saying she was glad she decided to get off Tinder and walk to a bar. Shortly after, Jackie and the man left the bar together and headed to Shots and Crafts, where they joined a group of women around 9:45 p.m. The pair left Shots and Crafts together. The detectives used CCTV footage to track Jackie and the man she was with, following their journey to the convenience store where the man had parked his car. Jackie was seen getting into the car, and at that point, everything seemed fine. However, this was the last time Jackie was seen alive before her murder. The detectives interviewed the bartender at the Fry Street Public House, where Jackie had gone to apply for a job. The bartender remembered Jackie having a friendly conversation with him and a male customer, but he had no information about what happened to Jackie and the man after they left. The detectives also reviewed security footage from Shots and Crafts, where Jackie was seen with the man and a group of women. One of the women remembered receiving a business card from the man, who was a personal trainer. She had exchanged contact information with him because she was interested in fitness. Although this detail seemed insignificant at first, it would later prove to be a crucial discovery in the investigation. To their amazement, the woman still had the card in her hand and was more than willing to share the information with the investigators. On the card, they found the name Charles Bryant. By that time, the detectives had already obtained footage from Walmart, taken at 4 a.m., which clearly showed Charles buying a shovel. The detectives then conducted a thorough investigation to uncover the true identity of Charles Bryant, who was the last person seen with Jackie before her murder. Their discoveries proved to be deeply unsettling. Charles Bryant, a 29-year-old man, lived about 20 miles away from Denton, but for some reason, the city held a strong attraction for him. What was drawing him to Denton was a desperate attempt to rekindle his relationship with his ex-girlfriend, Caitlin, who was a resident of Grapevine and a student at the University of North Texas. In May 2016, Caitlin graduated from high school and met Charles Bryant at the restaurant where she worked in Grapevine, Texas. Charles, a personal trainer and bartender in his late 20s, stood out from the boys Caitlin knew from school. His tattoos showcased his muscular build, and Caitlin found his unique skills and mysterious nature intriguing. That summer, Caitlin and Charles spent most days together at Grapevine Lake, and their attraction grew stronger daily. While Caitlin was captivated by Charles, her mother grew concerned about their significant age gap and worried about her daughter's well-being. Caitlin's mother asked to see a picture of Charles, and initially, she was willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. However, when she looked into his piercing eyes, she felt an instant sense of unease. It was as if she was staring directly at evil. As her concern for her daughter's well-being grew, she voiced her worries to Caitlin, urging her to reconsider the relationship. But Caitlin dismissed her mother's warnings, insisting that Charles was nice to her, unaware of the sinister nature lurking beneath his charming facade. At first, Caitlin was happy with her new boyfriend, but as time passed, doubts began to creep in. She started questioning whether her mother had been right. Charles seemed overly self-absorbed and manipulative, and Caitlin couldn't shake the feeling that he had an inflated sense of self-importance. He would constantly remind her that she could never find anyone better than him, making her feel bad about herself. By mid-August 2016, Caitlin was preparing to leave for college in Denton, and she had decided to end her relationship with Charles due to the numerous red flags she had noticed. However, Charles showed up at her home the next day, pleading with her to give him another chance and promising to change. Caitlin was persuaded, and they got back together. Only a week later, Caitlin moved to Denton to start her freshman year at college. After settling in, she finally broke up with Charles for good. Charles, however, refused to accept the breakup. On August 24th, the police found Charles on the University of North Texas campus during a traffic stop. They initially suspected him of driving under the influence, but his blood alcohol level was within the legal limit. Instead, he was arrested on several outstanding warrants and subsequently released. Charles returned to the University of North Texas several hours later and knocked on Caitlin's dorm room door, which he had surprisingly tracked down. When Caitlin answered, she immediately called 911, and by the time the officer arrived, Charles had already disappeared. The officer questioned Caitlin, who explained that she had ended their relationship due to Charles' abusive behavior and the way he spoke to her. As a result, the officer issued Charles a temporary no-trespass order, prohibiting him from entering the UNT campus. Despite this, Charles was undeterred and determined to find ways to reach Caitlin, despite the restrictions. On August 31st, Charles coincidentally encountered Caitlin on her first day at a new job. Recognizing him, Caitlin asked Charles to leave. She then scheduled a meeting with her manager to discuss the situation and request that Charles be barred from entering the business premises. However, the manager regretfully informed Caitlin that he lacked the authority to grant her request. This incident ultimately forced Caitlin to quit her job. Despite her best efforts to avoid him, Charles was more determined than ever to confront Caitlin. He was hell-bent on exacting revenge and causing her even more harm. The vicious cycle of fear and intimidation continued, driven by Charles's all-consuming obsession, putting Caitlin's life in constant danger. Meanwhile, Caitlin's decision to stay on campus at the University of North Texas worried her mother sick. Her mother begged her to return home, where they could keep her safe, but Caitlin was adamant that she was safe in her dorm room. She felt secure within the university's walls. On September 6th, a terrifying incident shook Caitlin to her core when Charles suddenly showed up at her dorm on campus. As he pounded on her door, Caitlin's worst fears took over, and she hid in her roommate's closet. From her hiding place, she could hear Charles coaxing her to come out, claiming he had something for her. Her darkest fears began to materialize, and her mind raced with frightening scenarios of what Charles might have planned for her. Caitlin was terrified for her life, so she made a quick decision and called 111 from inside the closet, speaking in a whisper because she was afraid Charles could hear her. The dispatcher asked her to speak up several times, but Caitlin was too scared to talk clearly. No matter how hard the dispatcher tried, Caitlin's voice was barely loud enough to be heard because she was so frightened. The police arrived soon, but Charles had already run away. However, he left a creepy reminder that he had been there, flowers, and a 2-page handwritten letter addressed to Caitlin. The letter had disturbing messages that made the young woman even more afraid. Just a few minutes after the incident, the police caught Charles outside the campus, dressed in exercise clothes, as if he had been jogging. As a student, he was arrested for trespassing and released on bail a few hours later. Despite Caitlin's efforts to cut off all contact with Charles by blocking him on her phone, email, and social media, he kept finding new ways to reach her. Charles created multiple accounts to make sure he could still communicate with her. Recognizing that Charles's behavior had become increasingly threatening, the police intervened to help Caitlin obtain a protective court order. The very next day, she formally filed a petition for the order, which granted her legal protection against further harassment. However, despite his first arrest, Charles continued to attempt to contact Caitlin. These unwanted communications led to his second arrest for stalking, as he repeatedly violated the terms of the protective order. It was his third arrest within 2 weeks of his second arrest. Charles posted a $5,000 bond and was released from custody while out on bail. Charles Bryant went to Fry Street, a location where Caitlin frequently spent time. Although there was only circumstantial evidence, detectives were certain that Charles had met Jackie Vander Griff there, possibly linking him to Jackie's murder. However, no physical evidence existed. When the detectives assisting Caitlin with her stalking case at UNT learned that Charles was the prime suspect in a murder, they grew concerned for Caitlin's safety. Caitlin claimed she was okay, but in the days following Jackie's murder, Charles sent her numerous photos, texts, and emails. On September 18th, the police took Charles into custody for violating Caitlin's protective order. During his incarceration, detectives hoped to uncover more evidence linking Charles to Jackie's murder. While being interrogated, Charles was shown a picture of Jackie and claimed to have seen her at the bar, but denied knowing anything about her. Concurrently, a search warrant was executed at Charles's residence. The search yielded a large military-style knife and a Texas Woman's University purse, which was identified as Jackie's school purse. Additionally, the search team found a kiddie pool that had gone missing from Charles's backyard, matching the one where Jackie's body was discovered. The detectives sought the expertise of a seasoned professional who had worked with prolific killers, including the Texas Rangers. This expert was knowledgeable about the mentalities of individuals like Charles, aware that they often have a strong urge to discuss their crimes. When the interview started, Charles claimed to have no memory of Jackie. However, the expert suspected he was hiding something. The expert thought Charles knew more about Jackie's fate than he was letting on. To build trust, the expert created a relaxed atmosphere, making the conversation feel like a casual chat between friends at a bar. The expert suggested possible scenarios, trying to see if Charles would react or take the bait. They portrayed Jackie as the one who had led Charles on, causing frustration. Throughout the conversation, the expert used different tactics to gauge Charles's reactions. However, This approach was risky. If the expert pushed too hard or seemed insincere, they might lose Charles's trust and harm the investigation. So, the expert had to find a balance, staying friendly while trying to get Charles to reveal the truth. During an interview, an expert closely watched Charles's responses and body language to gain insight into his character. The expert pretended to help Charles recall the events surrounding Jackie's admission, but in reality was conducting a brief memory test. To the expert's surprise, Charles' story changed slightly during the test. At first, Charles claimed he knew nothing about Jackie's admission, but later revealed that he had spoken to her at the Fry Street public house when she applied for a job. As the conversation continued, the expert decided to take a different approach. They ordered pizza, hoping the food would help Charles relax, and the detectives could uncover the motive behind Jackie's murder. The detectives suspected that Charles' uncontrollable rage towards his ex-girlfriend, Caitlin, was the catalyst behind Jackie's death. The interrogation lasted around 3 hours, during which Charles admitted to unintentionally killing Jackie during what he called kinky sex. He claimed the incident occurred in his car, and Jackie had asked him to choke her with an oversized zip tie he had. However, Charles maintained that the death was an accident. When Charles Bryant was accused of murdering Jackie Vag Riff, his ex-girlfriend Caitlin went on social media to look at Jackie's Facebook page, only to discover they were already friends. It suddenly came to Caitlin's mind that she had received a friend request from Jackie's Facebook page on the very day Jackie's body was found. Before Caitlin was even aware of the case, she was convinced that her ex-boyfriend Charlie, who was the suspect in Jackie's murder, must have used Jackie's phone to send her the friend request. Additionally, the police also believed that a tweet sent from Jackie's account after her death, which read, "Never knew I could feel like this," was actually sent by Charles after he murdered her. Christy was shocked when she learned that Charles, a man she had met on a dating app a year earlier, was facing a murder charge. To her, Charles was a quiet and reserved person. But during their brief time together, she noticed some disturbing signs that raised her concerns. Christy said that Charles quickly became clingy and attached to her, which eventually led her to end their relationship. But Charles persisted in pursuing her, going so far as to profess his desperate love for her. This declaration caught Christy off guard, especially since they had never even shared a kiss. Christy's experience working with abused children gave her a unique insight that helped her identify certain patterns in Charles's behavior. This led her to suspect that he might have been a victim of childhood abuse, a pattern she had seen in some of the young clients she worked with. One day, Christy found the courage to ask Charles directly if he had been abused as a child. To her surprise, Charles confessed that he had indeed suffered trauma in his childhood. Although the police couldn't verify Charles's claims, Christy believed him. She maintained contact with him, albeit from a distance, because she felt sympathy for him and didn't think he was capable of murder. The autopsy of Jackie's body failed to provide clear answers about her cause of death and where she was killed before being dismembered and set on fire. The lack of insight from the autopsy results raised concerns for the prosecution, leaving key questions unanswered about the circumstances surrounding Jackie's death. Charles admitted to disposing of Jackie's body, claiming she had died accidentally during rough intercourse. Despite this, he pleaded not guilty to her murder. Caitlin, Charles's ex-girlfriend, was called to testify by the prosecution to share her experiences with his stalking behavior and violent tendencies. The goal was to establish a connection between his anger towards Caitlin and the eventual murder of Jackie, who bore a striking resemblance to Caitlin. When Caitlin took the stand, she was visibly uncomfortable and reluctantly identified Charles, commenting that he had a smirk. Overcome with emotion, she left the courtroom in tears. The judge ultimately ruled that Caitlin would not be allowed to share details of her relationship with Charles or their breakup with the jury. In April 2018, a year and a half after Jackie's tragic death, Charles Bryant, went on trial for her murder. However, Jackie's best friend was too traumatized to attend the trial, finding it unbearable to face Charles in person. The thought of confronting him was a painful reminder of the devastation he had caused to their lives. Hello, friends. Welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Jonathan Hoffman. Jonathan Hoffman was born in Michigan in 1994 to Jennifer and Michael Hoffman. His sister Jessica was born 3 years later, and from a very young age, the two siblings formed an unbreakable bond and shared a special connection that would last a lifetime. However, Jonathan's parents, Jennifer and Michael, faced significant struggles in their marriage, and their frequent fights often forced them to leave Jonathan and Jessica in the care of their grandmother, Sandra. Sandra, Jennifer's mother, played a crucial role in the lives of her grandchildren, providing a safe, loving, and nurturing environment for them. The children cherished the time they spent with their grandmother, who offered them a sense of stability in an otherwise tumultuous upbringing. In 2008, after years of turmoil, Jennifer and Michael divorced when Jonathan was a senior at Farmington Central High School. Following the divorce, Jennifer made the difficult decision to relocate the family from Michigan to Arizona. This move was particularly hard for Jonathan, who was forced to leave behind the only life he had ever known, including his friends, familiar surroundings, and the comfort of his childhood home. The situation rapidly deteriorated for Jonathan and his family after they moved to Arizona. Not long after their relocation, his younger sister Jessica fell critically ill. Medical tests revealed a tumor in her brain, prompting urgent surgery to remove it the very next day. Although the operation was a success, it entailed a lengthy convalescence, and Jessica spent an entire month recovering in the hospital. Throughout this period, Jennifer dedicated herself fully to her daughter's recovery, neglecting her own needs in the process. This left Jonathan feeling abandoned and lonely, forced to navigate the challenges of adolescence in a new state without the emotional support of his mother and sister. Recognizing the strain Jonathan was under, his grandmother Sandra reached out to Jennifer, deeply concerned about her grandson's well-being. Believing familiar surroundings and old friends would bring Jonathan solace, Sandra suggested he return to Michigan to live with her and her husband Fred. Jennifer worried whether her 74-year-old mother would be capable of caring for him, but Sandra reassured her that she was more than capable. 1 month after the Hoffman family's move to Arizona, Jonathan returned to Michigan and moved in with Sandra and Fred. The homecoming brought Jonathan immense joy and relief midway through his senior year of high school. Thrilled to be back among friends and family, he felt a sense of comfort and belonging he had missed in Arizona. His friends recall that Jonathan was initially shy, but once he opened up, he was a lot of fun and loved to make people laugh. With a zest for adventure, he was always up for trying new things. Although Jennifer deeply missed her son, she embarked on the journey to Michigan to spend 2 weeks with him. During her visit, she was dismayed to discover that Jonathan had been smoking marijuana. However, Jennifer viewed this as a typical phase of teenage experimentation and was confident it didn't involve harder substances. With a heavy heart, Jennifer bid farewell to Jonathan, confident that he would be in good hands with his grandmother. But little did she know, Jonathan was in grave peril, and it was at the hands of his grandmother, Sandra. On May 19, 2017, at 5:27 p.m., Jonathan Hoffman made a frantic 911 call, his voice trembling as he relayed to the dispatcher that his grandmother had shot him and he was dying. The dispatcher sprang into action, swiftly dispatching police and paramedics to Jonathan's residence. As she spoke to him, she tried to reassure him that help was on the way, her voice steady amidst the chaos and fear in his. Suddenly, an ominous silence fell on the line, and for a moment, the dispatcher feared the connection had been dropped, or worse, that Jonathan had succumbed to his injuries. But then, just as her heart sank, she heard a barrage of gunfire erupt from the phone, followed by a pained cry. Jonathan yelled, "Ow!" as his voice cracked with terror, telling the operator that his grandmother had shot him again. The West Bloomfield Township Police Department officers responded swiftly to the scene, arriving at Sandra Lane's house at 5:33 p.m. As they approached, the sound of gunfire echoed from within the residence. Trained to handle such situations, the officers didn't hesitate, taking necessary precautions to ensure their safety. They positioned themselves behind their patrol vehicles, using them as cover from their vantage point. Observing a woman moving inside the house, they issued clear, direct commands, ordering the individual to put their weapon on the ground. After a tense moment, the officers heard the sound of a gun being secured, and with the assurance that the person inside had put the firearm away, they entered the residence. When the police made it inside the home, they found 74-year-old Sandra Lane standing before them, a Glock 17 .40 caliber handgun at her feet. Sandra repeated several times in an eerily calm tone that she had murdered her grandson, stating the disturbing sentiment as fact. One of the police officers asked Sandra why she had killed her grandson, but she remained silent, offering no explanation. 2 minutes after the police arrived, Sandra was handcuffed and placed in the back of a patrol vehicle. Officers entered her home to find the victim, whom Sandra claimed was her grandson, 17-year-old Jonathan Hoffman. Inside the home, the air was thick with smoke, making it difficult to see through the haze as they ascended the staircase. They reached the landing where Jonathan lay motionless, face down on the hardwood floor, dressed in gym shorts and socks. The young man's body was riddled with gunshot wounds to his upper torso. Despite the severity of his condition, the medics managed to detect a faint pulse. With urgency, Jonathan was rushed to Botsford Hospital, where a team of medical professionals worked tirelessly to stabilize his condition. However, their efforts ultimately proved futile, and after 30 minutes of intense medical intervention, he was pronounced dead. After the ambulance rushed Jonathan Hoffman to the hospital, police secured Sandra Lane's home as a crime scene. The 3-level residence was a labyrinth of violence and blood, with nearly every room telling a grim tale. Crime scene investigators arrived, meticulously combing the area for clues to unravel the shocking events. As they descended the basement staircase, they were struck by footprints in the blood-stained floor, crucial evidence carefully preserved. Deeper in the house, the team found 10 bullet casings scattered throughout, each one collected and analyzed. One investigator discovered a bullet hole in the drywall, and the search for more evidence led them to the second floor, where a gun case filled with ammunition was found. While gathering evidence, investigators took extra care to photograph Sandra, capturing her face, arms, and hands as she sat in the patrol car. Sandra became overwhelmed, tears streaming down her face. Amidst the chaos, Fred Lane, Sandra's husband, appeared outside the house with their dog, claiming to have been gone for an hour, a walk he took after Sandra asked him to. Fred was stunned to discover that his wife, Sandra Lane, had confessed to shooting and killing their grandson Jonathan after he was pronounced dead at the hospital. The police faced the daunting task of breaking the news to Jonathan's family that their beloved son had been murdered by his own grandmother. As detectives dug deeper into the case, they learned that Jonathan had been living in Michigan, separated from his parents and sister who resided in Arizona. When the detectives shared the devastating news with Jennifer, informing her that her mother had taken the life of her cherished son, she was left in a state of utter disbelief. It seemed unbelievable that someone who was supposed to love and care for their grandchildren could commit such an atrocity. The fact that Jonathan was his grandmother's favorite made the tragedy even more incomprehensible, leaving everyone wondering how he met his end at Sandra's hands. As the day drew to a close, around 7:30 p.m., the police decided to take Sandra Lane to the hospital for a health evaluation, given her advanced age. While waiting in the emergency room, Sandra maintained that Jonathan had never harmed her, describing him as a kind boy who never hurt anyone. After a medical assessment, the doctors cleared Sandra of any suspicious injuries. With this, the police decided to return her to the patrol car and take her to the police department for further questioning. On May 20th, after midnight, Sandra's attorney met her at the police station before she provided her official statement to the police. Seated alongside her attorney, Sandra sought legal counsel when the detectives eventually met with them. Sandra's story took a dramatic turn at the police station. Contradicting her initial statement at the hospital, where she had claimed her grandson was not involved, she now alleged that she and Jonathan had engaged in a heated altercation involving yelling and screaming. During this confrontation, Jonathan had kicked her in the stomach, leaving her fearing for her life. According to Sandra, Jonathan's behavior had become increasingly erratic and angry of late. He would come and go from her house at all hours, frequently bringing over people she didn't care for. Furthermore, Sandra had noticed that valuables had gone missing from her home, leading her to suspect that Jonathan or his friends might be involved in theft. Sandra also mentioned that her grandson had a history of run-ins with the law. Sandra stated that Jonathan was pulled over by an officer while driving, and cannabis was found in his car. However, this didn't deter him, and he was stopped again by an officer shortly after. This time, he was found to be in possession of Adderall. Sandra also recalled an incident where she had to call 911 due to Jonathan's aggressive behavior. During that episode, he was yelling obscene remarks at her. Despite this, when the police arrived, Sandra persuaded them not to arrest him. According to Sandra, she was compelled to buy a gun due to Jonathan's behavior. Sandra alleged that everything escalated on May 18th when she accompanied Jonathan to the probation department due to his non-compliance with his probation terms. After returning home, Sandra stated that Jonathan threatened to take her car, which led to him attacking her. Since there were no witnesses to Jonathan's shooting apart from Sandra, the detectives faced a significant challenge in verifying her account. Sandra claimed self-defense, prompting the detectives to conduct a thorough investigation into the incident. Their primary concern was ensuring they didn't wrongfully send a 74-year-old frail grandmother to prison for defending herself against a violent teenage boy. The detectives examined the photo taken by crime scene investigators immediately after Sandra confessed to shooting Jonathan. However, upon reviewing the evidence, they found no signs of violence on Sandra, not a single scratch, which would be expected if she had indeed been in a physical struggle. During her court arraignment, the judge ruled that Sandra should be held on bond while awaiting trial at the correctional facility. Paul Walton, the prosecutor on the case, believed the 911 call made by Jonathan clashed with Sandra's self-defense claim. Upon listening to the call, Walton noticed a significant 2-minute and 51-second silence before Sandra fired another shot at Jonathan. Based on his observations, it seemed clear that Jonathan was already severely injured and no longer posed an immediate threat to Sandra. However, Sandra's defense team presented a contrasting argument. They countered that Jonathan still posed a threat despite his injuries. The defense highlighted a portion of the 911 call where Sandra yells, "Let go," implying that Jonathan was still attacking his grandmother, even in his injured state. The defense argued that Sandra was simply an innocent and loving grandmother. They pointed to the end of the 911 call, where Sandra can be heard instructing her bleeding grandson to lie down and promising to get him water, as proof of her compassionate nature. According to the defense, these statements revealed Sandra's true character as a caring and empathetic woman. Prosecutor Walton was perplexed by Sandra Lane. Was she a doting grandmother forced to make the ultimate sacrifice in a desperate situation, or a ruthless killer who stalked her own grandson, callously ending his life in the woods? To uncover the truth, Prosecutor Walton conducted a series of interviews around town. The testimonies uniformly portrayed Sandra as an ordinary, kind-hearted grandmother. She regularly visited the local salon, actively participated in her synagogue, taught Sunday school, and volunteered her time. Her generosity and affluence were also well known. What struck the detectives most was the resoundingly positive feedback from those who knew Sandra. They described her as deeply devoted to her grandchildren, particularly Jonathan. The testimony seemed to starkly contradict the heinous act she had confessed to committing. However, a different narrative unfolded when the detectives spoke with Jennifer, Sandra's daughter, and Jonathan's mother. Jennifer offered a contrasting perspective on her mother's character, contradicting the image projected by the community. She described her mother as a controlling and abusive figure, vastly different from the warm and compassionate person others had portrayed. According to Jennifer, her childhood was marked by constant parental fighting, with her mother physically assaulting her on multiple occasions. Her father's frequent absences left Sandra in complete control of the household, allowing her to behave like a tyrant, prone to violent outbursts. Years later, when Sandra remarried Fred Lane, Jennifer witnessed a significant shift in her mother's behavior. Sandra expressed deep affection for Fred, believing him to be a stabilizing influence in their home. Initially, her controlling nature seemed to subside. However, after Jennifer gave birth to Jonathan, Sandra allegedly attempted to reassert her dominance. Jennifer claimed that her mother's obsession with the baby bordered on an unhealthy level, with Sandra becoming so fixated that Jennifer jokingly wondered if she wanted to kidnap the child. After Sandra was charged with murdering her grandson Jonathan, the community of West Bloomfield surprisingly rallied around her. A significant number of residents believed Jonathan was a drug user who got what was coming to him, sparking a wave of support for Sandra. On social media, community members posted messages of encouragement, affectionately referring to her as Granny and using the hashtag #GoGrannyGo. In this narrative, Jonathan was vilified as a monster, while Sandra was portrayed as an innocent, frail, elderly woman. Jennifer revealed that most of her family had bought into Sandra's self-defense story, effectively disowning both Jonathan's memory and herself. Throughout the ordeal, Sandra's husband Fred stood by her side, offering unconditional support. The medical examiner concluded that Jonathan Hoffman's death was a homicide resulting from the multiple gunshot wounds he suffered. An examination of the wounds revealed stippling, indicating that the gun was fired from varying distances. Additionally, a toxicology report revealed the presence of synthetic marijuana, also known as spice, or specifically K2, in Jonathan's system. At the time, spice was widely available in West Bloomfield, particularly among teens and young adults, who could purchase it at gas stations without identification. There were numerous reports of individuals experiencing adverse reactions to the substance, including violent behavior after consumption. 1 month prior to Jonathan's death, a disturbingly similar incident occurred involving another student from the same high school. Michael Cipriano, a classmate of Jonathan's, murdered his father, Robert, after a heated verbal argument. According to reports, Michael was under the influence of the synthetic drug spice at the time of the attack. Jonathan's sister, Jessica, harbored a deep affection for her brother, but she was also aware of his emotional instability and occasional violent outbursts. Despite her reluctance to consider it, she couldn't shake the suspicion that her brother might have harmed their grandmother, leading her to ultimately shoot and kill him. 2 months after her arrest, Sandra was arraigned in circuit court and indicted on 2 additional charges: possession of a firearm and committing a felony. Furthermore, she faced a distinctive charge known as open murder, which is only applicable in select states such as Nevada and Michigan. This unique charge encompasses both first and second-degree murder. Prosecutor Paul Walton was concerned that the jury might hesitate to convict a grandmother of premeditated murder, so he opted to present the jury with a broader range of options. This decision displeased the defense, who felt that the prosecution was shirking their responsibility. In 2013, Sandra Lane faced trial for the murder of her grandson, sparking widespread national outrage. Many directed blame at the boy's mother, Jennifer, for sending him to Michigan to stay with Sandra. Throughout the trial, the defense portrayed Sandra as a devoted and loving grandmother, but the prosecution disputed her claim of self-defense. They presented telling images of Sandra taken after the shooting, highlighting inconsistencies. Her clothes remained unripped, her jewelry was still intact, and her hair was styled as usual. Moreover, bloody footprints found in the basement, matching Sandra's shoes, implied that she had searched for additional ammunition. After the prosecution rested its case, Sandra's defense team presented their argument to bolster their stance. Sandra's attorney took a calculated risk by allowing her to testify on her own behalf. The attorney believed it was crucial for the jury to hear directly from Sandra herself, giving a first-hand account of the experiences she had while living with her grandson Jonathan in the months leading up to his tragic death. According to Sandra, Jonathan had a history of violent outbursts, often kicking in doors and breaking objects. On one occasion, he even shattered a computer monitor. On the day of the incident that ultimately led to Jonathan's death, Sandra alleged that he struck her in the head, leaving her feeling threatened and terrified. As a result, she decided to retrieve her gun, hoping it would serve as a deterrent to protect herself. Her intention, as stated in her testimony, was not to take her grandson's life, but rather to stop him from getting back up and attacking her again. However, during cross-examination by prosecutor Paul Walton, Sandra's account began to unravel. Under Walton's pressure, Sandra conceded that her motivation for obtaining the gun was not fear for her safety, but rather a desire to get Jonathan to listen to her. This admission severely undermined her credibility as a witness and made it increasingly difficult to argue self-defense. Experts testified that the K2 spice found in Jonathan's urine at the time of his death suggested he was not under the influence of the drug when he died. The presence of the drug in his urine indicated that it had already been metabolized, casting doubt on Sandra's claim that Jonathan was high on the drug and violent. After hearing the evidence presented at the trial, the jury deliberated for 2 days before returning a guilty verdict for second-degree murder and the use of a firearm during the commission of a felony. Sandra was subsequently sentenced to 20 years in prison. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Sarah Ann Wood. Sarah Ann Wood was born on March 4, 1981 in New York. Raised in a devout family, her father served as a pastor in a small town in the state's middle. From a young age, Sarah, along with her older sister and brother, attended services at her father's church and Sunday school. Dancing was her passion, poetry brought her joy, and she was an enthusiastic member of her school's cheerleading team. Sarah loved nothing more than riding her bike, often using it to get to her father's church, less than a mile from home, for services, Sunday school, or to lend her father a hand. On August 18, 1993, when Sarah was 12, she rode her bike to church for Sunday school, following her usual routine. With her father staying home, the classes were conducted by other church members. Her parents expected her to return immediately after the classes, but as time passed and she failed to appear, they grew increasingly anxious. After waiting a little longer, they headed to the church, thinking Sarah might have lingered behind with friends, but she was nowhere to be found. The Sunday school teachers reported that she had departed on her bike soon after classes, taking with her a few books, some colorful folders, and a small display board. Her parents' concern escalated because the ride home from church should have taken only a few minutes, and it was unlikely Sarah would have gone elsewhere with all those items. Moreover, she always sought permission before deviating from her routine. Her parents retraced the route to the church, inquiring with neighbors if anyone had seen their daughter, leveraging the small town's familiarity and Sarah's father's church connections. Dozens of people quickly joined the search, and they soon found a witness who had seen Sarah riding towards her house around 2:30 p.m., just a few hundred yards from her home. This sighting only intensified her parents' anxiety, convinced that something had indeed happened to Sarah, prompting them to contact the police. The local police department swiftly launched a search operation, deploying dozens of officers to scour the area. The sheriff also requested assistance from the fire department, and they joined forces to aid in the search. News of Sarah's disappearance spread rapidly throughout the community, prompting dozens of volunteers to join the effort. Within the first few hours, several hundred people were involved in the search. The police concentrated on the route from the church to Sarah's home, meticulously searching the fields and woods on both sides of the road. Their efforts soon yielded a disturbing discovery. Just a few yards into the woods, they found Sarah's bike leaning against a tree. The police centered their focus on that area and quickly uncovered the items Sarah had brought from Sunday school, hidden beneath a nearby bush. These findings led investigators to a grim inference. It was likely that Sarah had been abducted. They theorized that an unknown assailant might have dragged her from the road into the woods, left her belongings behind, and then taken her away in a vehicle. The police department launched an all-out search effort, pouring all its resources into finding Sarah. Meanwhile, her restless relatives took matters into their own hands, printing flyers with details of her disappearance and distributing them not only in their hometown, but also in surrounding cities, with the help of dozens of volunteers. Despite their collective efforts, the first day's search yielded nothing. Police and volunteers scoured the area within a several-mile radius of the road until nightfall, but no new leads emerged. The search resumed the next morning, with even more people joining the effort. The state police also joined the investigation, focusing on identifying a potential suspect. Investigators questioned every resident in town, hoping someone might have spotted a suspicious stranger or vehicle linked to Sarah's disappearance. Sarah's parents set up an improvised headquarters, manned by dozens of volunteers, who printed and distributed flyers, scouring for witnesses or leads that could bring them closer to finding Sarah. As local media picked up the story, news of her disappearance spread nationwide within days. The police received over 1,000 tips, meticulously investigating each one, but repeatedly hit dead ends. Concerned residents helped the parents raise a substantial $150,000 reward for any information about Sarah's whereabouts. But unfortunately, this too yielded nothing. The active phase of the search continued for about a week, before the police concluded they were unlikely to find valuable leads in the area. They shifted their focus to finding a potential suspect, scrutinizing local residents and convicted criminals from neighboring towns, but to no avail. Sarah's disappearance was featured on 2 popular national television shows, triggering a new wave of tips. Her parents made regular appeals to the public through the media, pleading for any information about their daughter's whereabouts, but her fate remained a mystery. This continued for nearly 6 months, until a surprising breakthrough occurred. On the morning of January 7, 1994, 12-year-old Rebecca left her home in a small Massachusetts town and set out on her walk to school. As she strolled down a deserted street, she noticed a man walking alongside her. He attempted to speak, but Rebecca couldn't hear him due to her headphones. When she removed them, the man brandished a gun and warned her that if she obeyed his every command, he wouldn't harm her. He grasped her jacket, and they continued walking in the same direction. Rebecca was terrified to scream or attempt to flee, aware that even if she complied, the man might still kill her. As they walked, she quickly devised a plan. Feigning an asthma attack, she struggled to breathe and sat down on the ground. The man released her jacket, instead gripping the edge of her backpack as she continued to act as if she were suffocating. Seizing the moment, Rebecca slipped out of the backpack straps and sprinted away from her kidnapper. A few hundred yards away, she spotted several adults and rushed towards them, exclaiming that someone had just attempted to abduct her. Meanwhile, the kidnapper sped away in his car, taking Rebecca's backpack with him. One of the witnesses took it upon himself to tail the kidnapper in his own vehicle. After a few minutes, the witness pulled over at the nearest gas station and alerted the police. The witness was able to provide a partial license plate number and the car's model, while Rebecca gave a detailed description of the kidnapper's appearance. The police promptly launched a search for the vehicle, scouring databases for matching cars. They also sent out alerts to neighboring towns, and their efforts were rewarded that very evening. A patrol officer driving through a nearby small town spotted a vehicle matching the description. He pulled over and knocked on the door of the house where it was parked. Inside, he found several people, and upon inquiring about the pickup truck, the owner explained that he hadn't driven it in a while due to his loss of sight. He revealed that his neighbor, 43-year-old Louis Lint, frequently borrowed the truck. Louis, a handyman, assisted his blind neighbor with various household tasks in exchange for using the pickup truck. According to Louis, he last drove the truck the previous day and hadn't used it since. Nonetheless, the officer asked him to come to the station for questioning, and Louis complied. Despite his earlier denial, Louis continued to insist that he hadn't used the pickup that day and had no involvement in the attempted abduction. He claimed to be a devout Christian who spent most of his free time at church and would never engage in such an act. While Louis was at the station, the police took his photograph and presented it to Rebecca and other witnesses in a photo lineup alongside pictures of other men. Unanimously, they identified Louis as the kidnapper. Investigators promptly obtained a warrant to search Louis's house and the vehicles, including the pickup truck owned by his neighbor. Their search yielded a disturbing discovery: a small bag containing duct tape, a knife, children's sunglasses, and candy in Louis's van, which was parked near their house. Additionally, the police found a gun and Rebecca's backpack inside the house. Investigators uncovered a shocking discovery: a large, secret room dug out beneath the house, still under construction. With this substantial evidence, the police arrested Louis for the attempted abduction. Initially, he maintained his innocence, but soon decided to confess to everything. He admitted to traveling to Rebecca's town in search of a victim, bringing along his kidnapping bag that he always kept in his car. Louis then explained the purpose of the secret room he was digging under his house, and his story left even the police stunned. He revealed that he planned to convert it into a fully equipped bunker where he intended to hold kidnapped victims captive. Louis confessed to aiming to abduct 11 girls between the ages of 12 and 17 to satisfy his horrific fantasies. He added that until the room was completed, he didn't plan to keep his victims there for long, intending to kill them within a few days. In Louis's house, the police also found a list of several names. Upon identifying these individuals, they realized they were all children living in close proximity to Louis's home. Following his confession, Louis was placed in jail awaiting trial for attempted abduction. Investigators continued to visit him to gather additional information, and during one of these visits, he unexpectedly confessed to another crime. Louis revealed that 4 years prior, in October 1990, he was working as a janitor at a movie theater in the same town where he later attempted to kidnap Rebecca. On the evening of October 22nd, he left work and spotted 12-year-old James Bernardo riding his bike near the parking lot. Louis instantly decided to abduct him, intending to assault him. Louis offered James $5 to help set up chairs in the movie theater, and the boy agreed. Louis led him to the empty theater where he bound him. He then drove his van closer to the entrance, dragged the boy and his bike inside, and took him to his home. He left the boy there and drove to a nearby lake to dispose of the bike by throwing it into the water. Louis returned home and attempted to assault the boy, but was unsuccessful. Frustrated, he decided to dispose of the victim. He dragged him into his van and drove to a neighboring state, where he murdered the boy and left the body in the forest. A hunter soon discovered the body and reported it to the police. However, despite their efforts, detectives were unable to identify the culprit over the course of several years. Now, upon comparing Louis's statement with the case materials, investigators discovered that he had provided an astonishing number of facts and details about the crime that perfectly mirrored reality. Following Lewis's confession, news of his case spread like wildfire throughout the country. Within just a few days, police realized they were dealing with a man who not only had attempted to abduct a girl and was building a secret bunker for other victims, but had also confessed to a murder that no one had suspected him of. New York investigators searching for Sarah Wood soon caught wind of Lewis's case. They delved into the details of Rebecca's attempted abduction and requested more information about Lewis himself. Interestingly, profilers had previously created a profile of Sarah's potential abductor, and Lewis seemed to fit it remarkably well. The investigators decided to pay him a visit and headed to the prison. During the interrogation, he revealed that frequent visits to the neighboring state were motivated by close family ties. Lewis also admitted that he would often drive through small towns in search of victims, and on August 18, 1993, he spotted Sarah walking along the road with her bike. According to his statement, he pulled up beside her, got out of the car, and forced her into the van at gunpoint. He then tied her up, dragged her belongings and bike into the nearby woods to conceal them, and drove her hundreds of miles to the mountains. In a remote area by a large lake, he assaulted and killed her, eventually burying her body in a hole. The police launched an extensive search effort around the lake, mobilizing hundreds of volunteers, park rangers, and the military. However, the vast size of the lake posed a significant challenge, making it nearly impossible to cover the entire area, even with such a large search team. Furthermore, with months having passed since the burial, the location could have become overgrown with vegetation. After weeks of searching, they were unable to find either the body or any evidence. Detailed testimony with precise details of the abduction was sufficient to charge Lewis with the murders of both Sarah and 12-year-old James. In January 1995, Lewis was sentenced to 17 to 20 years in prison for the attempted abduction of Rebecca. The following June, the trial for James's murder began, and Lewis pleaded guilty before the judge. He confided in his lawyer that he wanted to confess to Sarah's murder immediately, but when he entered the courtroom and saw her parents, he abruptly changed his mind. However, just 9 days later, when he was brought into an empty courtroom, he finally admitted his guilt. Despite this, he persisted in refusing to disclose the burial site, ignoring the desperate pleas from Sarah's parents. The prosecution offered Lewis a deal in exchange for information about Sarah's whereabouts. In return, they promised to serve his sentence in a state prison instead of a federal prison, as Lewis had requested. He agreed and began collaborating with investigators. Lewis identified a specific area near the lake and even sketched a rough map. Although the police wanted to take him along on the search, his lawyer cautioned against it. Undeterred, the police organized extensive searches in this area, braving the snow and freezing temperatures, with the help of hundreds of volunteers and heavy equipment. Despite their efforts, they were still unable to find Sarah. Several months later, with autumn's arrival, the police launched another attempt, but it ultimately proved unsuccessful. Throughout this period, detectives endeavored to extract more specific information from Lewis, but he persistently refused to divulge the exact location or assist the police in their search. Eventually, the prosecution opted to revoke the deal, and on April 11, 1997, Lewis was sentenced to 25 years in prison, the maximum sentence the judge could impose without the discovery of the body. The judge added that if such evidence were available, he would have certainly handed down a death sentence. During the trial, Lewis's lawyer attempted to mitigate the punishment in all three cases without disputing his client's guilt. He argued that Lewis suffered from an unidentified mental disorder, citing claims of hearing voices in his head and alleged protection by aliens. However, experts found no evidence of any mental disease and concluded that Lewis was likely feigning these symptoms to avoid severe punishment. After the verdict, detectives persisted in visiting Lewis in prison, hoping to coax him into revealing Sarah's burial site. His behavior was erratic, and he provided contradictory information, naming different locations. On one occasion, he claimed he wasn't ready to disclose the location because he had buried Sarah alongside another victim, and he didn't want anyone to uncover the identity of this other person. Despite the emotional pleas of Sarah's parents, who also visited Lewis in prison, he remained resolute in his silence. The detectives were also exploring Lewis's potential involvement in other unsolved cases. Having confessed to the abductions of Sarah and James, the police had little doubt that he had additional victims. Almost immediately after his arrest, they uncovered another attempted abduction he had made several years prior. Lewis had tried to grab a girl off the street, but her father intervened, and they reported the incident to the police, although detectives couldn't identify the perpetrator until Lewis's photo appeared in the news. Lewis was also suspected of being involved in 4 unsolved disappearances between 1985 and 1992, and investigators concluded that he had the capability to commit these crimes, but no evidence was found, and Lewis refused to confess. Despite this, his story didn't end there. Detectives continued to visit him after his sentencing, hoping he would reveal Sarah's whereabouts or confess to other crimes. However, it wasn't until 2013 that Lewis suddenly had a change of heart and confessed to another murder. He admitted to being responsible for one of the crimes he was suspected of. According to Lewis, on November 6, 1992, he abducted a 16-year-old teenager with developmental disabilities who was riding a bike to his grandmother's house. He claimed to have forced the boy into his van, then killed him and dumped his body in a lake. Investigators confirmed his involvement based on his detailed description of the events, although official charges in the case have yet to be filed against him to this day. Currently, Lewis is 73 years old and remains incarcerated for 2 murders and an attempted abduction. Sarah's parents hold on to the hope that they will eventually persuade him to reveal the location of her burial site, or that he will divulge this secret before his death. In memory of Sarah, her relatives also organize an annual bike ride. Initially attended by just a few people, the event has grown steadily, with several thousand participants now regularly taking part. This event also helps raise significant funds to support